Last week we talked a lot about we defined. We're talking about the three mentalities, the three modes of thought: Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft that come from Hegel, and we talked about how we it was our first week really trying to get into the third mode, Vernunft, and we started by putting it in opposition to the other two. And I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen so that I can put that diagram back up again that we had last week. It's not a perfect diagram. It needs a lot of work. These should be trees instead of stars. Stars way too abstract. But the idea of distinguishing what is actual from what we have experienced and felt and remember from what we have systematically learned or constructed for ourselves as an abstracta. This is Begriff and this is Verstand, and they each have their approach to the world. We talked about the way that they loop back in on themselves, and each of them comes to think that it is a complete view of the world and a correct view of the world, and that as Hegel lays out the schema, the great strength of Begriff is its concreteness. That even though the star in our head is not the star that's actually out there, it has a lot of sensory input and detail to it, including things that we don't know how to quantify or systematize. There's colors and scents and sounds, and there's feelings that we had, and there's life experiences that we had, all of which are actually part of treeness. We just can't describe them systematically. And Begriff retains all that, or at least it retains the parts that made an impact on us. But Verstand, the downside of Begriff, the downside of Begriff to compensate against that concrete richness of detail is that it's parochial. It's obsessed with one perspective, our own perspective, how we interacted with the thing. And as a result, it doesn't include anything that we never experienced. There's a blindness to the larger world that's built into Begriff. And that's why it circles back in on itself and takes for granted that it has seen everything, because it cannot conceive of what it has not experienced, right? Begriff is about the experience. Verstand escapes the claustral envelope of Begriff by abstracting. You abstract from yourself and your feelings. You abstract from your experiences. You get educated. You learn to systematize and reason. And you begin building these abstract frameworks that reach out beyond your experience to the larger cosmos. As Hegel says, one of the strengths of Verstand is that it has this ability to reach towards the universal, away from the parochial. But the problem is it does it at the cost of losing the concrete. So where Hegel calls Begriff the concrete particular, which we could also think of as the concrete parochial, Verstand has the universal, but only in an abstract form, where it's lost all the richness of reality, and it's become a framework that's useful to schematize and think about and organize around. And so as a result, it too is excluding enormous amounts of reality. It's reaching out to the wider world beyond our experience, but at the cost of losing all the richness that makes actuality different from our thoughts. And in that richness, as Kant demonstrated when he was trying to replace morality with ethics, a lot of things that are necessary for the survival of the species and the health of individuals and cultures get suppressed as irrelevant nonsense, gibberish. And what you're left with is way too prone to be nihilistic, to be able to be so focused on the pragmatic and utilitarian that it can draw conclusions like, well, if we just murder these million people here, it'll be great for the rest of us. Verstand is unhinged. It's unleashed from the controls. The emotional controls that evolved in us. They had this experience in World War II. The Nazis were frustrated because they'd have soldiers trying to execute Jews, and they do it for a while, and then they break down. They just lost it. They had to be relieved of duty because they couldn't do it anymore. Because it turns out at the Begriff level, we are hardwired not to want to hurt each other, and inflicting large amounts of pain or death, especially when you're close to it, and you experience it so that your begriff mind is engaged, it breaks the stranglehold sometimes, and frequently. It breaks the stranglehold that Verstand has, where it's trying to suppress all those things. And so this is where, as much as in the modern world, we still try to blame the gulags and the Holocaust and all these other things. We try to blame them on begriff. We try to blame them on the subjective mind. We say, oh, people were just bigots, right? They were just angry and hateful, and that's why they did those things. But of course, what that leaves out is that at the Nuremberg trials, when we actually put those people on trial, they weren't angry. They were very calm and organized and orderly, like the death camp commandant who couldn't figure out why he was on trial at all. He says, you should be giving me a medal. I made everything better. I mean, we weren't hardly killing anybody when I was put in charge at first, but I made everything so efficient that, people were just flying through this death camp, dying like, my numbers were incredible. So give me a medal. He didn't understand. He wasn't angry at the people that he was murdering. He was systematizing. And this is the thing that we don't want to come to grips with, because we are still a systematizing culture, and we don't want to acknowledge that it is unhinged from the things that matter. By definition, it has suppressed the things that matter, and it's focused on the things that are useful. So this is where we started, right? And we were trying to define Hegel's third mode of thought, Vernunft, last week, in terms of how it is not these two things, right? Where they are claustral and turn in on themselves, it reaches outward. And so as a result, where they're finitizing because they create a limited world, either limited in scope, but possibly unlimited in richness, or unlimited in scope, but limited in richness and turned into abstracta. In either way, they close in on themselves, and they make it impossible to imagine vast swaths of reality. They become labyrinths. An experiential labyrinth or an intellectualizing labyrinth. But either way, it turns back in on itself. And the process of engaging in those thoughts, we think that it brings us closer to the world and truth and meaning and right and wrong, but it actually extends the labyrinth around us, the experiential labyrinth, the systematic intellectualizing labyrinth, so that we are further and further trapped within ourselves and turned back inwards when we ought to be reaching out to the world around us. So Vernunft, we can see if it is different from these two, if these two are the basal metabolism of the mind, according to Kenneth Smith and Hegel and others, then this is an incomplete mode of existence for a human being. We were never meant to stop with Begriff and Verstand. We have a third faculty that can only develop after these two have been developed and enriched, to the point that it's possible to triangulate and reach outward beyond them. Until we've developed those capabilities, we can't get much further on the third mode of thought. It depends upon them. They're its foundation. But we can see by comparison and contrast, if it's reaching into a new dimension that the two of them can't conceive of, then that dimension has to be infinitizing, specifically because they're finitizing. And it has to be cosmopolitan to escape the parochialness of Begriff, but at the same time, it has to be concrete to escape the abstract systems of Verstand. And so Hegel calls this third mode of thought the concrete universal. He says it retains the richness of meaning that Begriff has, but is able to apply it beyond one's own experience. Which sounds like, from within the terms of Verstand and Begriff, that's a contradiction in terms, because they claim to have divided up the whole realm of possible ways of envisioning the world, and those ways of envisioning the world exclude combining those two things. You can't put those two things together. They're not. It's not supposed to happen. But Vernunft does it anyway, right? It's a paradox that way. The last time, and now we're setting up the juicy bit. We're getting ready to go to the juicy bit. Last time we said the key is the reason these are both forms of idiocy, Begriff and Verstand, because when you're trying to answer the question, what is true, what is meaningful, and what is right or wrong, instead of looking out to the world that existed before us and will exist after us and exist at the same time as us, we look inside our own head. And we think that's the source of truth and meaning and right or wrong. We either trust our experiences / feelings / memories, or we trust our systems of ideas and laws and what have you to tell us what's true. In both cases, failing to and what's meaningful and what's right or wrong. In both cases, failing to realize that we're too obsessed with our own thoughts and our own experiences. And our own is the definition of the word idiota. It makes us an idiot to always be turning back into ourself as though we are God. It is a self-deification that's not justified. To argue that, let's see. Oh, she's in. I saw Ginny just join. So it's a kind of self-deification of the ego, to claim that our experiences or our thoughts are always the one-stop shop for us when it comes to knowing what's true or what's meaningful or what's right or wrong. And the problem is that the logical ways that we think about trying to escape this trap, if we ever do realize it's a trap, the logical ways that we think about trying to escape it are all expressed in Begriff terms or Verstand terms, or both, because those are the only two tools in the toolbox until we transcend them to the third level. As long as we're working within this, we're going to keep trying, we're going to keep thinking that somehow the truth, if it's not in Begriff and it's not in Verstand, it must be in some combination. This is what we tell ourselves, right? We're still stuck in that mode of thought. And so we think, maybe what if we compromise between them? What if we balance between them? What if I compare my Begriff to Donald's Begriff, and between them, maybe that's where the truth is? Or maybe Donald's Verstand can be compared to Dave's Verstand, and maybe that's where the truth is. And so most people never get out of this flatland of Begriff and Verstand because there's an enormous number of futile but seemingly self-confirming possible ways to combine Begriff and Verstand that make us feel like maybe now we're not an idiot, right? We'll just read a lot of books. We'll just go to a lot of classes. We'll just learn more stuff and experience more stuff, and that will somehow escape the flatland of experiencing and learning things. And you see, when you say it out loud, which we never do as moderns, you see how absurd and futile it is as a proposition. You're going to escape the flatland by using the tools of the flatland. Well, all they'll do is expand the flatland. So what this tells us is that Vernunft must be, to be a third mode of thought that moves beyond the limitations of these two, it must not involve merely talking amongst each other and thinking a lot and reading a lot. It must involve turning out of the human world back to the natural world. Vernunft is driven by nature. And the reason it's driven by nature is that nature effortlessly accomplishes astonishing feats of organization of complexity and longevity and health that go far beyond anything human beings have ever managed to do deliberately. You know, a space shuttle, we think of a space shuttle as one of the most complex things we've ever made. And yet, the level of organization in a space shuttle is inferior to the level of organization of a single human skin cell. Because a single human skin cell can harness the environment around it, bringing in proteins, fats, carbohydrates, and other elements, water, and so on, and use them to rebuild itself. And the space shuttle falls apart every time you fly it. Tiles are dropping off of it, screws are getting loose, and none of them fixes themselves. It's a dead mechanistic order. It's a Verstand order. It is grossly inferior to what a skin cell does. A skin cell regenerates itself and creates itself, and it can split and make two skin cells. And if you can get the thing to go back to being a stem cell, you can create a whole person out of one. Like, none of our machines can do anything like that. You see what I mean? There is a healthfulness and a sustainability and a capacity for regeneration and forming complex systematic wholes that nature does. If it did it even once, it would be better than we are. But instead, it does it, for all intents and purposes, infinitely. There's like nowhere you can turn in the natural world and not see, if you look closely enough, that these amazing regenerative, life-creating things are going on around us. Like in the human body, I can't remember what the count is of the number of cells in the human body. But each and every one of them is all doing it at the same time. It's like it wasn't done once to make us. It's being done trillions of times over and over all the time. It's absurd. It's actually hard to take in because it doesn't directly fit our experiences. It's happening at tiny scales as well as macro scales, and we sort of can't visualize all those scales at the same time, so we can't take in what's happening. But also from the Verstand side, we can't measure it. We can't quantify it. You couldn't even quantify it in your own body. So if you tried to pin down the numbers for each cell that would somehow, if you were just good enough and analytical enough, would describe one cell, they're all changing at the same time you're trying to measure them. It's like literally, for all intents and purposes, you could work your entire life just trying to map out one instant of that life in a Verstant way. That's how far beyond the levels of understanding we have our own body is. And there's billions of us. And there's all these other species around us all doing it at the same time. And ostensibly, there are other planets out in the cosmos. You start doing the math, on stars and solar systems and galaxies and so on. And the numbers are just enormous. So this is almost certainly happening elsewhere too. So for all intents and purposes, nature is a deeper, more profound, more successful source of order than anything we've ever done. So if we're looking to transcend the limitations of Begriff and Verstand, the obvious choice is to look to nature. It's like right there. When in the X-Files, they're always saying the truth is out there. It's like this has become my motto for human epistemology. For the love of God, stop focusing on our own experiences and thoughts and turn your head around and look outside that tiny little sphere of a cranium, because out there is all this stuff happening all the time that could be sources of information, that could be sources of truth, that could be sources of meaning, that could be sources of right or wrong. Now, where we ended last time, we got that far last Monday, right? I've burned up a half hour out of the 6 half hours we have, but this was important, right, to set this up. Where we ended last time was with the observation that there is a problem with this approach, and the problem is that nature does not organize its truths or its meanings or its right and wrongs in a way that is pre-digested and pre-chewed for us and laid out in our laps ready for us to consume. Kenneth Smith often uses the adjective lappy. He says, human beings demand that truth and meaning and right and wrong just be laid in our laps, preferably pre-chewed, and made as appealing as possible. And even then, we won't believe it a lot of the time, because lies, of course, are manufactured for us deliberately to be as appealing as possible. And our behaviors have been trained to make us love those lies, just like you could be addicted to sugar or nicotine or alcohol. In the same way, we are addicted to lies. We love falsehoods that have been crafted to be as tasty as possible for us. And that nature doesn't care whether we agree with what's true or not. I mean, we're happy to go out there and believe that that's not a cliff and step off it. Nature's fine with that. We'll die, and somebody else might not make the same mistake. This is how nature's fine. If a species wants to run off a cliff and be gone, then it's gone, and some other species that isn't that stupid will take its place. Nature has nature could care less whether we're able to figure out our epistemology and axiology. That's up to us. It's our challenge. And so the problem that we have is when we look at nature, it doesn't provide us with as easy a source of answers as our experiences and our thoughts and systems of ideas do. Indeed, our experiences and our thoughts and systems of ideas have evolved to the point that they feel compelling to us. Our own ideas feel reasonable. Our own feelings feel compelling. We're hardwired to find it satisfying to look inward. And when we look outward, the parts that satisfy us are the parts where we overlay what we see with our experiences and our thoughts. And then it's actually the experiences and thoughts that are satisfying us and not reality itself. We have a disconnect. We have a problem where we can't quite get ourselves to plug into however it is that you're supposed to extract truth and meaning and right and wrong from the dizzying kaleidoscope menagerie that is nature. I mean, if I look at a tree, what is this supposed to mean to me? How am I supposed to decide right and wrong from looking at a tree or a rock? And I'm aping Verstandt's complaints, right? Because Verstant thinks this whole idea that there's some other dimension of thought or other approach is stupid. It thinks that what it does is the end total possibility of human truth. That nothing could be better than Verstand. And anytime we attempt to describe Vernunft, what Verstand is going to hear is they're going to hear us praising Begriff, whether we are or not. They're going to collapse the differences between Begriff and Vernunft back down into Begriff and say, I see that your ideas are contaminated with emotionalisms and subjectivity and value judgments. And as we all know, those things are evil. They're bad. They're chaos. They're the source of all things that are wrong in the world. If only you could be more abstract and calm and objective and rational. So Verstand is going to fight us tooth and nail every step of the way that we go to try to postulate what Vernunft looks like. And we have to be prepared for that because it's in us. We spent our whole lives being acculturated to be very good at Verstand. That's why we're not dead. That's why we're not homeless, right? Modernism is ruthless in its training. We either learn to do Verstand or we're homeless. It's like it will whip us hard until we either get it or we suffer. So the same is true of Begriff. Begriff isn't going to want this either. Begriff can barely conceive of Verstand. Verstand people to Begriff are like cold people or mean people, right? But someone who inhabits Begriff primarily as their master is going to model people who are treating Verstand as their master. It's going to model them as some kind of Begriff person. And of course, it doesn't fit, as the Verstand people know full well, because they pulled out of Begriff. But the Begriff people are still going to do it anyway, because that's the Procrustean bed they have to make everything fit on. So when they look at Verstand people, they're going to be like, how do I explain you experientially and emotionally? You must just be mean. Why wouldn't you care about what I care about? Why wouldn't you have feelings for these things? Why wouldn't, maybe if I just share my experience with you, then you'll empathize. And by the way, you see this in US politics all the time, where one side says maybe the reason we're fighting is we haven't shared enough experiences. Or from a Verstand perspective, they say maybe we just haven't explained ourselves clearly and methodically enough. If only I lay out my logical syllogism, surely you'll be persuaded. You see a lot of this with Democrats versus Republicans in US politics. They can't conceive of each other as being different character types. These two character types, they don't fully grok each other. And the last thing in the world they're going to want to be able to do is grok Vernunft, which is like, a step too far. So when I talk about the problems of trying to use nature as a source of truth or meaning or right or wrong, on the one hand, people will be inclined to collapse this whole discussion down by saying, well, yeah, of course it's hard. You have to use other things, especially because we live in a Verstand world that says the universe is meaningless until human beings give it meaning. This is like the most stereotypical axiological position of the modern era. And yet the people who say it always think they've come up with this idea on their own, right? And where we got it from was medievalism. It was the medieval god who sucked all the meaning out of the world and said, I am the source of all meaning. There are no other gods. There's no other magic. There's no other meaning. There's no other truth. Only me. And in the course of doing that, everything else became meaningless, which set up the modern era when we overthrew God and we're left with a meaningless cosmos. So we have a problem. There's a major pushback if we assert that nature can be a source of truth, meaning, and right and wrong, which is that we've all been trained to say, nuh-uh. No, people are. We decide what's meaningful. That rock has no meaning until I decide that I want it to decorate my garden, or I decide I want to hit my brother over the head with it, or I decide that I want to swallow it. That gives it meaning. And until then, it is a meaningless thing. This is the modernist take on nature. So you will often see in Kenneth Smith's essays, you'll see him complaining one way or another about the way that academia and especially academic philosophy will push back on his philosophy and say that it's just subjective, that it's primitive, that it's backwards because it's emotionalist. But the point is that Vernunft refills our conception of the cosmos with experience and emotion and meaning and right or wrong, but it refills it in a way that's different from how it's filled in Begriff. In Begriff, that subjective filling is the whole point. It's the master. But in Vernunft, that subjective filling is the servant. You with me so far? I'm still contrasting. I still haven't got to the punchline. And it's the same with Verstand, right? From a Begriff perspective, someone who's engaging in Vernunft looks like they're engaging in Verstand, because the whole point of Vernunft is that it incorporates both mental faculties into what's happening. And so from a Verstand perspective, a Vernunft person is doing entirely too much Begriff. And from a Begriff perspective, a Vernunft person is doing entirely too much Verstand. Each of them sees the other in Vernunft because they're used to a purified environment that's all about their own thing. So the question is, the assertion is that Hegel is making and that Kenneth Smith is making is that you can look at nature with both Begriff and Verstand as servants instead of masters. And you can look at all this complexity, the baffling noise of all the things happening all the time, and somehow inside of that, you can see something simpler and clearer that can take the place of our experiences and our ideas as a source of truth and meaning and right or wrong. What is that simpler thing that Vernunft is looking for and that uses as its master? Or rather, that uses the search for it as its master? What is that thing? And at the end of last session, I said it was archai. I said it was archai, which is a term that we don't have an English equivalent for. English is a thoroughly modernized language. Most of the traces of medieval and ancient order have been stamped out of it, redefined as something modern. And that applies to archai. If we ever had a word that meant what archai means, it doesn't mean that anymore. It means something else. This is an unstatable thing, this idea. Heraclitus talks about these things. He says, the phenomena that we take for granted in the world are being generated by something deeper and invisible. And if you study that deeper invisible thing, which he calls the logos, confusingly, if you study that deeper invisible thing, it can be a source of truth and meaning and right or wrong. But it's hard to find because nature loves to hide. You have to seek, you have to turn over a lot of experiences looking for this thing. You need to broaden your experience and your education as much as possible before you're going to begin to see the patterns of the archai. And Hegel talks about this too in his philosophy of nature. But the general idea is as follows. Archai are in some ways like natural laws. Like E equals mc squared is not an archaic statement. It's a Verstand statement. And the reason it's a Verstand statement is that it is measurable, is clearly defined, it's crisp. You can say what it applies to and what it doesn't apply to. And that's it. That is, it shares Verstand's quality of being seemingly universal and yet so abstract as to not actually giving us much to go on in the way of guidance in our lives, right? Okay, so it's nice that E equals mc squared, but should I build a nuclear bomb and drop it on somebody? E equals mc squared doesn't tell me that. It has literally, it's completely evacuated of value judgments. So we know it can't be one of these archai we're looking for. Because the archai we're looking for come laden with emotion and value judgments. When we encounter a true archai, we cannot help but react powerfully, right? That's one of the defining characteristics. Archai engage us not only as a Verstand level, but at a Begriff level. Our experiences and emotions and our thoughts are both going to be powerfully provoked when we encounter one. And because these two modes of thought that we're using to try to develop the third mode of thought are finitizing, it follows that the archai we're looking for, they're going to be bigger than that. They're going to be infinitizing. And it means that when we attempt to describe what we have encountered, we're going to fail. The process of engaging with archai is a process of failure over and over and over. Successive failures that you try to learn from, successive approximations, attempts to come at the thing. And this is where the polyperspectivalism of Kenneth Smith's philosophy is so central. Archai are bigger than we are, and they're more complex than we are. And so no single perspective that we can have will ever be adequate to sum one up. You will never be able to write E equals mc squared or anything like it about an archai, because it transcends that. It's one of the ways that you know you found one. It's going to make your head hurt. And it's going to make it so that you wish you had a lot of other people engaging in Vernunft to be able to give you their different perspectives on that arche than you have. And as you compare perspectives to each other, you will each feel like you're getting a glimpse of the elephant. Look, it's a rope. Look, it's a sword. Look, it's a tree trunk. Look, it's a, as you put all those pieces together, you're starting to go, oh my God, it might be an elephant, right? But but only if an elephant were an infinite thing instead of a finite thing. That's what the experience is like of coming at one. And if you don't have that experience when you're approaching something that you're thinking might be a candidate arche, then it is not an arche. That's one of the tests. If it's finite and clearly describable, it's not an arche. Which is funny because, to be fair, even a tree is not finite and clearly describable, right? I mean, you can schematize drawings of a tree or measurements of a tree, but from neither of those things can you reconstruct the actual tree. Even a tree is infinite, but it's infinite in a boundable way. You can draw a circle around it and say, here it begins and ends, and you can describe a bunch of its qualities. And you seem to be in the general neighborhood. But what you find happens when you're dealing with archi is that you could be describing them forever and still not get to the end of it. And you're still only beginning to sense them like big, giant, invisible presences stomping around in your lives. And it's like, oh, there it goes. I don't see it, but I hear it go by again. Or there's that whiff again that I get that always makes me think of X. So one of the trails, one of the spoor of archi is paradox. Heraclitus writes in paradoxes for a reason. Heraclitus was hard on the search for archi. He is an archaic philosopher, and archaic doesn't just mean old the way we moderns use it. It also means the stage of civilization that is closer to the founding archi, back when the civilization was focused on the deep principles that make civilization possible. And it had to be focused on them because it was creating that civilization out of nothing. It was trying to pull people together into a new form of order. And the only way that that could work is if it found powerful, compelling archi from which it could create a mythos culture that could bond us together long enough to unify and think of ourselves as a people and be sustainable. All of those things are only possible when you're plugged into archi, which is what makes these cultures archaic. Now, some of this sounds like I'm just making assertions, and that's because we haven't yet got to the point. So let's dig into the point a little more. So I'm not going to be able to tell you definitively what any archi are, but I will be able to describe some archaic things, some things that have the paradox and flavor and infinitude of archi. And after you see a couple of them, you'll start to get the flavor of them. And you'll start to know that it's not just Hegel or Heraclitus or Kenneth or I asserting that they exist. You'll recognize the pattern. Even though we have no words for it in English, all human beings experience archi. They're all around us in the world, everywhere, all the time. And as we begin to see examples, the pattern matching powers of our brain will engage our recognition centers, and we'll go, oh yes, that thing that's a major part of my life, but that I can't quite talk about or think clearly about, that's an arche. And that's the focus of Vernunft. So let's do some examples. This was what I did on the drive to Tacoma on Friday. The easiest example to start with isn't exactly an arche, but it has the flavor of archi, and it's something we've talked about before. And it works as an appetizer, as a palate cleanser. It's not a meal, but it's a taste. And what I want to talk about here is tragic inversion. When we talk about the way that Greek tragedy works, we say that most things can't be tragedies. Some idiot blindly doing idiotic things, no matter how sad it is, isn't a tragedy. According to the Greeks, that's a comedy. People incurring the consequences of their actions when it was a foregone conclusion to everybody that that was going to happen. That's the realm of comedy in the old Greek sense. No, to them, tragedy is when you have a protagonist who's full of virtue and they are doing the right thing as best they can. But their story reaches a state of tragic inversion in which the their virtues begin to turn around and work against them. Everything that they do right is at the same time the right thing to do and also the wrong thing to do. And they're digging themselves in deeper and deeper by doing the right thing. Now, it doesn't count as a tragic inversion if they're doing the wrong thing and digging themselves in deeper and deeper. That lacks paradox. That's trivial. That's the realm of comedy. It's if they're doing the right thing. It is the best choice that they could make. And any of us might make that choice. And yet they're still getting dug in deeper and deeper. When our strengths become weaknesses in a paradoxical form and we get hoisted on our own petard because we did the right thing, that's the heart of tragedy, the tragic inversion, the paradoxical situation in which we are confronted with the fact that the cosmos is infinite and infinitely complex, but any individual and any individual mode of thought, character, or culture is finite, and as a result, cannot possibly do justice to the cosmos. And in many parts of our lives, the approximations we come up with are good enough. And so we use our limited mortal perspective and we get a good outcome. And we say, see, that's because we're so right, or so accurate, or so careful, or so virtuous, or so educated, or whatever virtues we want to heap on ourselves. So methodical. But the problem is that in other parts of life, our finitude collides with the infinitude of the cosmos in such a way that the exact same behavior now hangs us, works against us. And like Oedipus, we dig ourselves in deeper. You know, the story of Oedipus Tyrannus starts with him learning the prophecy that he's supposed to kill his father and marry his mother. And so he does the most logical thing you do. He leaves his father and mother and goes far, far away. That's what anybody would do, right? I don't want to do either of those things. So I'm going to do the right thing. And it's only because he does the right thing. If he had not done the right thing, he never would have killed his father and married his mother. Because the people he thought were his father and mother were not his father and mother. The people he fled were the people he should have stayed with. And the people he fled to were the people he should have stayed away from. But he didn't have the bigger picture. His perspective was finite in an infinite cosmos. And so he took the virtuous action and it led him to do exactly the wrong thing and make everything as bad as possible. And of course, the rest of Oedipus Tyrannus is again about him trying to be a good king, trying to cure, the miasma that overhangs Thebes, to solve the mystery of what has gone wrong so that he can be a good king. And the farther he gets in solving it, the clearer it becomes that he's a bad king. And he would never have found that if he wasn't such a good king. If he wasn't bothering to look, if he wasn't being responsible, if he wasn't striving with all of his might to solve the problem, he never would have uncovered what actually went wrong. Like the whole culmination of that play is that the outcome had to come out that way. It's not the gods tricking Oedipus, playing tricks on him and being mean the way that we think fate works as moderns. We don't believe in fate, but if we do believe in fate, when we see it in stories, we think it's because the author cheated, right? The genie in the lamp cheated. He didn't give us what we wanted. He just was playing grammar, syntax games with us and giving us, the letter of the law, not the intent. But as Heraclitus says, and here, by the way, is a second arc, something related to archai. As Heraclitus says, it would not be better for men if they got exactly what they wanted. Not if they got some cheating version of what they wanted. If they got exactly what they wanted, it would not be better for men. We want the wrong things. We don't know what we should want. This is Heraclitus hanging a paradox around begriff and saying right down to the basal metabolism of our brain, we are drawn to things that are not healthy for us. And that's a problem because when we look around in nature, we see trees growing towards the light like they should. We see them putting down roots to access minerals and water like they should. We see all of these animals that seem to be in harmony with the cosmos, where the things that they want usually lead them to the right outcome. And then we look at humanity, and there is some kind of terrible, tragic inversion in us, where it is way too easy for us to crave the things that are our destruction. What Pavlov did with dogs is nothing compared to what's done with us. And not just in the modern era of PR and the manufacture of consent, because Heraclitus was bitching about it 2,500 years ago. He was looking around ancient Athens and going, my God, what is it with us and the things that we want? Why do we so consistently want what's bad for us? How do we keep being drawn into this tragic inversion? It's terrible. And when you experience that, when you stop fighting it, when you stop pretending that Heraclitus is lying or being unfair, when you stop trying to do the Verstand thing of disproving it through cherry picking finite examples. Oh yeah, well, I once wanted this thing and I went and got it and it made me healthier. So there. So we don't want the wrong things. I mean, you can hear the arguments, right? There is a series of complaints that Verstand would have in reaction to what Heraclitus says. And there's another series of complaints that Begriff would have. Begriff would complain even more bitterly because Begriff is so driven by appetite. They do not want to hear that their entire way of life leads them into folly, even though it does. But if you can actually embrace the truth of this, that there is something weird in human beings that has been inverted so that we are so often drawn to what hurts us instead of what helps us, you can smell the whiff of archai passing by. We're not there yet, but we're in the neighborhood of the deep things. The deep things have a couple of qualities. If we compare tragic inversion and we compare the way we want the wrong things to each other, we start to see a pattern forming. And one of them is, first of all, is paradox. When you're in the presence of archai, logical reasoning breaks down into paradox. We begin to see that the same thing can be both true and false at the same time. The same thing can be both right and wrong at the same time. It could be about us and not about us at the same time. And not just in some sneaky, subtle, I suppose, for the sake of argument way, but in some kind of deeply ananke necessary driving force way. Right? Consider being and non-being, another of Heraclitus's favorite subjects. Right? Into the same rivers we step and do not step. We are and are not. The river's changing and we're changing. And so can we be said to be the same person at the end of the step that we were at the beginning of the step? Or have we become someone else? If we exist in a state of constant flux and becoming, even if it's gradual, even if there's continuity, concepts like we exist or we don't exist, or we are not, begin to fall apart. And these seem like pretty basic fundamental concepts, right? What's real and what's not real is pretty foundational to Verstand. It goes to the law of the excluded middle. There's some things Verstand wants to be very clear about. And if it can't be clear about them, all of logic falls apart. And what Heraclitus is telling us is, that's great. Look around you. It's falling apart everywhere. Like literally at the same time, everything is and is not. It's all becoming. So paradox. Paradox is one of the signs that you're getting into the neighborhood of archai. Now here's one of the more compelling signs, and then I'll give you an example of a real archai. Another one of the compelling signs, which we can see in both of these things, is infinitude. E equals mc squared is not a law about everything. It's a law about energy, mass, and the speed of light. It doesn't propose to tell you about everything. It's not trying to tell you about everything. It's trying to cut a neat surgical line through reality and describe the nature of that line and say, this line can be measured in all of reality this way, and it will always give you this answer. That's finite. It's a finite abstraction. It's a perfect product of the Verstand mind. But archai, they don't do that. They don't resolve down to an equation or a number. So when we talk about tragic inversion and the way that it manifests in human lives, the reason why the Greeks couldn't just write a single tragedy and be done with it, the reason they had to write tragedy after tragedy after tragedy, is that tragic inversion does manifest universally in all our lives, but it doesn't manifest uniformly according to some abstract law. Instead, it adapts to who we concretely, specifically are and manifests that way in us. It's not that there's some one virtue we've got wrong. It's that literally every virtue a human being can have suffers from our finitude colliding with the infinitude of the cosmos and creating tragic inversions. It blossoms differently in each one of us, and it blossoms not arbitrarily, but according to the necessary essential qualities that we have concretely that distinguish each of us from the others. When tragedy manifests, in David's life, it manifests in a David way. When it manifests in my life or Mahbub's life or any of our lives, it manifests in the way that would be distinctive to that person. It's not imposing a cookie cutter pattern on all of us. Instead, it is like a dimension that passes through us and grows into us in the way that we are already growing. You remember the Greeks used to say, we only become what we already are. The Greeks said, we are not just who we are, but we are seeds of our future selves. We are incubating the future. We don't just exist, we're becoming. We aren't just becoming, we're becoming other. They have the term aliosis, which means othering. We are othering ourselves. And everything is doing it all at the same time. And that these changes are not random, like John Carpenter's The Thing, bursting out with eyes and teeth for no reason out of nowhere. It's not like that at all. Instead, like Heraclitus said, there is a nature around us that is lawful, but there's also a nature within us that is lawful. The future that is unfolding within us is unfolding according to the specific characteristics of the seeds within us, and not according to anybody else's seeds. The Greeks really struggled to figure out how you talk about this. It's like there's no such thing as a distinction between form and matter. That clean separation that characterizes medieval spirituality and logic doesn't really apply to the cosmos, where matter also simultaneously seems imbued with spirit, not as something that's been poured into it, but as its very structure. I'll give you an example. Where do cell membranes come from in living organisms? Well, there's a lot of proteins in there shaping it, and people focus on the protein as a structuring element in life, but that's not where they come from. That's an additional element. Where they come from is the phospholipids, the fats, which have phosphorus more on one end than the other, which makes the fats lopsided so that one side is terrified of water and moves away from it, and the other side loves water and moves towards it. And as a result of that, if you drop water near a phospholipid collection, the phospholipids will rotate themselves without being injected with electricity, without some designer at a design board, without anybody thinking, I would like this to happen. All the phospholipids will automatically rotate themselves to orient the water-loving side towards the water and the water-hating side away from the water. They just do that. And as a result, if you've got 2 drops of water and phospholipids between them, the phospholipids closest to one drop will orient that way towards one drop. The ones closest to the other drop will orient that way towards the other drop. And in between, the water-hating ends of both molecules point towards each other, and the water-loving sides point outward. And that is the basic structure of all cell membranes in living organisms, because the phosphorus side loves water, and there's water outside the cell, and there's water inside the cell. So it's in the middle of the membrane that the water-hating part moves towards. That's the structure of all cell membranes of all living organisms. And it comes right out of something that phospholipids naturally want to do. Phospholipids may not have a brain. They may not have consciousness. They might not have a design board, but they have something that is almost impossible to talk about in modern English. They have intent without intelligence. They will do this. They will orient that way. You can hardly, to stop them, you have to destroy them. It is in their nature, according to their structure, to have behavior. We associate behavior with choice. with decisions, with being intelligent. So as moderns, we have a very hard time looking at what we call dead raw matter and acknowledging that it's not dead or raw. And it's not even matter in the sense that we mean the word matter. It has intent. It's going to try to do things. It's going to break down in certain ways. It's going to organize itself in certain ways. It's going to, and this is the part that's hard for us to grok. If it's built out of living materials, it will construct itself and grow in certain ways. This is built right into matter. So the thing is, when we talk about, when the Greeks are talking about why does your seed unfold the way that it does? Why do you become the future self that you are? It's because of who you are now. The structure and lawful natural order of who you are now means that you are changing, that your structure is, your inner nature is striving to become a different inner nature. Even your physical nature is striving to grow and change according to its own inner intent. Now, because this is so hard to talk about, intent, without invoking the brain, what Kenneth Smith and others often do is they invoke the word teleology, or telos, which comes from telos. And this is based on the idea that behavior, as Aristotle says, behavior has a kind of intention even when it's unconscious. It is trying to accomplish something or achieve something, or at least move in a direction or grow in a direction. And when we don't want to confuse this with conscious intent, we use the word telos. We say that telos is the end toward which something is transforming or moving or behaving. And its teleology is that whole path. The whole course from where you came from to where you are now to where you're going is your teleology. There's some very profound stuff here. And where it gets really profound is when we acknowledge that this is not fatalism, right? This is not saying that your teleology predetermines the outcome. This is about intent. And intent interacts with the nature within you, interacts with the nature around you. It's not a simple equation. You don't get to have what you want, but you strive for what you want. And that striving intersects what's going on all around you so that you modulate what you want. You express your teleology in ways that are compatible with the world around you to create a greater whole. I'll pause here for a sec. Go ahead, Joseph.
So I just have a quick question. Is Kant's idea of intent, is that he's saying that human rational thinking is the highest form of like that's what makes us human, and that's therefore that is the highest good per se, versus like where everybody, the nature, the idea of the Greeks, they're saying it's outside of us.
Yes.
That it's so that this is where Kant comes up with his categorical imperatives out of this. Okay.
Yes.
And this is where essentially that if we're the highest good and then we're only bounded to ourselves, that's where it could go horribly wrong.
Yes. All the contradictions and madness that come out of modernism can be traced. It's not Kant's fault, but it's traced through Kant because he expressed it so clearly. You can see the contradictions in it. How is it possible that the human mind is the source of truth, meaning, and right and wrong when the cosmos has been around longer than people have? Where did the cosmos come from then? It's inexplicable. And, Hegelian or Heraclitean archaic Greek concepts of nature center intent not just in the human mind, but in everywhere and everything, including things that we think of as stupid or dumb or not having consciousness, like rocks have intent. But it's not conscious intent. It's not the useless, frustrating, contradictory Kantian concept of intent. It's the archaic Greek concept of telos, that the matter and the structure have within them direction that they are unfolding towards, and their efforts to unfold in intersection with everything around them unfolding is what determines the final form they take. Just like the way a tree might grow towards the sun, but the sun keeps moving and other things keep growing around the tree so that it keeps modifying where its branches are going and where its leaves crop out. And the final form of the tree could not have been predicted from the seed of the tree. And no two trees will ever be identical for that reason, because their circumstances are all different. And yet, treeness and the teleology of treeing oneself is something that is so obviously true and real that everybody can see it everywhere on Earth all the time. It's going on all around us, even though it's never identical and can't be measured and cleanly defined.
Thank you.
Does that help?
It does. It does. Very much so.
Yeah, thank you for tracing that to Kant. That's an interesting point. Donald and then James.
Yeah, I had an old professor once trying to teach Aristotelian ethics.
Yes.
And he kept talking about this, that actions have intents, that is, or natural ends.
Yes.
That have nothing to do with the psychological state.
Yes.
Of the actor.
Yes.
And then he went off on this tirade about what has happened in modern legal theory with this concept of, good intent, bad intent, whatever.
Yes. Yes.
You don't need to understand, on Aristotle's terms, the psychological state of the actor. You just need to look at the action and understand what the intent of that action was.
Exactly.
And then you can judge it.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, fault lines in plate tectonics are going to do certain kinds of things. Certain kinds of things are going to happen more often around faults than happen anywhere else because of the nature of the fault, because of its structure. The structure gives it an intent toward behavior and direction of that behavior. And it will never express its intent purely or precisely because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists in a world full of other competing intents. And it's in the negotiation of those intents that the San Andreas fault releases when it does and how it does, and and so forth. And we get the consequences that we do. And so it's interesting because when you have conversations with people about determinism, they assume that a purely causal universe is one in which you can predict in advance everything that will happen. But that's not true at all. That would only be true if the universe were a finite mechanism. But if it's full of an infinite number of infinitizing intents, all negotiating with each other, then it's a computation nobody could ever make. The universe won't last long enough. It isn't big enough. You need something bigger than the universe to compute merely the next instant, let alone the one after that. So there is this way in which, we need to understand the archaic Greek perspective on this. We have to simultaneously be able to embrace this concept of causality driven by the intent, the telos of things, while also acknowledging that the telos of this thing in intersection with the telos of all the other things is going to lead to something that none of us could have foreseen. It can be lawful and unforeseeable at the same time, which is something Verstand despises and cannot accept and does not like at all. Verstand wants to reduce the universe to a machine that can be predicted and measured. The idea that we're dealing with an infinity of infinities all interacting with each other in lawful ways is just, it is hateful to Verstand. The idea is obscene. James and then Phil.
Yeah, isn't that kind of the tragedy of being human? That
yes.
We try to understand the world, and then based on that understanding, that we can never understand it fully. But based on our fullest understanding,
yes,
we try to posit, understand and posit what is good, and then act upon it.
Yes.
And like the story of Antigone, she has to do what she does because she believes, based on her understanding of what is good.
Yes.
And that leads to her downfall.
Yes.
But at the same time, if you don't do anything, then you are sacrificing your individuality and your freedom and your understanding of what you think might be good.
Right.
And,
right.
but it leads to, but for Hegel, doesn't that kind of tragedy lead to a higher higher understanding or higher vision of what is good? Or
yes, and this is where we start sniffing around the tail of Vernunft, is that Hegel says, yeah, it's tragic, but as long as we stay stuck in Begriff and Verstand, we'll never understand the full scope of the tragedy. And specifically, we won't understand it at the level that's required to move beyond the tragedy, to grow beyond it, and to find the meaning, and to make something better out of it. It's Vernunft that's required to grapple with Archai, because it's the only mode of thought that's willing to put the search for Archai as its master, ahead of Verstand and Begriff. And that means that you have to be not only comfortable with, but determined to wrestle with these maddening paradoxes that make up the fabric of reality. And I say fabric, but of course we really mean the charged, as Heraclitus says, the warfare of reality, the charged interpenetration of all things through all other things. That's constantly creating the order that we see around us, generating it from the intersection of these teleologies. So yeah, that's a great question. Thank you for that. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry I was late, but I was in another meeting that had to do with the philosophy of art.
Oh, nice.
So I'm late because of that. So I'm beginning to get the drift of the conversation, but from what I'm getting now is that because of this, quite often we think of, like, even the Buddhists think of the moment of awakening.
Yes.
You awaken to what it is. But what you're saying is that moment, in a way, is also unreal, because we have to be constantly awakening. We can't just awaken. And now I see it all, like I climb out of the cave, I see the sun, but it's constantly awakening and awakening, awakening.
That's right.
How can we do that without sleep? I mean,
that's our problem, right? That's our tragic condition. In order to approach reality, we must be constantly reawakening, because by the time we finish awakening, we have made some idea familiar to us. And as Hegel says, the familiar is for that very reason not understood for what it actually is. So the moment that it settles into a finite human perspective, it has lost its infinitude. And the cosmos is infinities within infinities. So when we look at it from a finite perspective, we are necessarily doing violence to the truth of the situation, even if it's a profoundly better perspective than the one we had before. Even if for a moment we grasp the infinities, once it settles down into our brain comfortably, now we've lost it again. We've lost it into a new, better place from which we need to reawaken again.
So it's a contemporary situation in a funny way. Then reflects that even better, because we know that since the 90s, at least, that information is doubling every day.
Yeah.
Now it's probably every half a day. So even dealing with the information itself, we have to constantly awaken to the information itself, let alone our interaction with the world.
Yes.
So therefore, people are always living on the edge, you could say, of this. And I think, I'm not sure if human beings are capable of handling that degree of anxiety.
Right.
I mean, standing on the cliff forever, and you think you step back, but the earthquake has made that disappear, and it's like you step back some more. So are we psychologically capable of handling that constant awakening? Or do we just say, lock in and say, fuck it all, I'm just gonna we're just gonna solidify to something that we can believe in, and that therefore we don't have to deal with the anxiety. Maybe we remain stupid, but at least we don't have the anxiety that's constantly upon us.
Yeah, so then we're only left with the anxiety from all of the horrific consequences of our idiocy. It's like this is the choice we have. And You're right to put your finger on this, because as moderns, we want to reduce everything to Begriff and Verstand. We don't want there to be a Vernunft. Everything about modern civilization is designed to rule out the possibility of Vernunft. If a Verstand person sees someone engaging in Vernunft, they will mistake it for Begriff. And if a Begriff person sees somebody engaging in Vernunft, they'll mistake it for Verstand. They cannot see it for what it is, because they are finitizing modes of thought, and Vernunft is an infinitizing mode of thought. So it cannot be reduced to them. It's, this is where, the story Flatland was really helpful. It's like, the inhabitants of Flatland, a sphere passes through Flatland and they think it's a circle that just appears out of nowhere, grows and then shrinks and then it's gone. And they think that's what happened, because they can't conceive of the idea that something passes through Flatland and it has its own shape. These are like impossible ideas. And so if there were ever a people unfit to answer the profound and important question you've posed, it's us. We are the least likely civilization in the history of humanity to be able to know whether it's possible to live in a Vernunft way, because we've just about exterminated it. When information is growing every year that way, it's all Verstand information and Begriff information, and almost none of it is Vernunft information, because we stamp that out as quickly as we can. So it's our strategy for being stable as a civilizational order is to eliminate the possibility of that third dimension. So that, because that third dimension asks the questions that don't make us comfortable. It's constantly coming up with these perspectives that call into question our assumptions. And the perfect machine order cannot survive being jostled over and over in that way. Just like, a computer can't handle someone coming at it with a hammer from every different direction. It was never meant for that. So to give a quick capsule summary for those who joined late, this week we're building on last week. Last week we promised that we would move beyond Begriff and Verstand to talk about Vernunft, not as merely the ways in which it's different from the other two, which is what we did last week, but what is it in itself? What is the third mode of thought trying to do? How does it find truth, meaning, and right and wrong? We said at the end of last session, it finds these things in nature, but we also said that's transparently nearly impossible to do because nature's so confusing and complicated. It's like, well, where? Begriff gives us simple answers. I feel angry, right? I like that. I don't like that. It's very simple and direct, and it gets right to our behavior. We know what to do about it. Even Verstand can give us very simple answers, right? Because Verstand can say, the law is this, obey the law. Or it can say, the logical thing to do is this, do the logical thing. But when we look at nature, it doesn't chew these things up and lay them in our lap in an attractive, easy to understand, easy to act upon way. Instead, it seems to be presenting us with paradoxes everywhere we look. I mean, either it's a whole bunch of details, too much to keep track of, or it's a bunch of paradoxes if we look underneath that. And, Verstand doesn't like paradoxes, and Begriff doesn't like it either. So neither of them knows what to do with this information. But this is what makes Vernunft different. Vernunft likes the scent of the paradox, because the scent of the paradox is a sign that we're on the trail of archai, the deep principles of the universe, that we might be able to squeeze for some juice, to get some truth, some meaning, and some right or wrong out of. And likewise, infinities, unmeasurable infinities, are a sign that we're on the trail of archai. Because all the infinities of Verstand, like E equals mc squared, are very tidy and clean and measurable. But the infinities of Vernunft, of the archai in the universe, they are unmeasurable infinities. So we gave two examples so far. We said the example of tragic inversion, right? Why is it that Oedipus's actions start to work against him? When he does the most virtuous, the rightest, the surest thing, it leads to his downfall in Oedipus Tyrannus. And it's because he's caught in that state of tragic inversion, in which his virtues are at the same time his vices. He didn't do the wrong thing, he did the right thing. And that's why he's screwed in Oedipus Tyrannus. Because the more he does the right thing, the more he discovers the trap that he's in. And then we compared and contrasted that with Heraclitus, when we said, why is it that people want the wrong things, right? We crave things that are bad for us. We look around us in nature and see all these things striving to do the right thing. We see trees growing towards the light and they succeed. And then we look at people and we see people reaching for self-destructive drugs, or entering bullying relationships, or killing one another, or doing other things that lead to their own destruction, and that they want it so badly. And why is it that we can have a craving for the thing that makes us sick? And what we saw in both of them that they have in common is that, unlike E equals mc squared, which is applied exactly the same way to every circumstance, that's a Verstand infinity. And using Hegel's terms, that's an abstract universal. What we see in Vernunft is a concrete universal. The infinity manifests differently in every different thing. And it doesn't manifest randomly. It manifests according to the lawful structure and teleology of the thing that it's manifesting in. So Phil, your tragic inversions, when tragedy happens in your life, will be very Phil-like things to happen. Whereas my tragic inversions, when they happen in my life, will be very Rick-like things to happen. They grow out of who we are, not just universally, but differently from each other, concretely, specifically. And that's one of the ways you know you're on the trail of genuine archai, right? If Heraclitus says we want the wrong things, he doesn't mean we all want the same wrong thing. We're off the same list of wrong things. He means for each person, when you look at what the things are that they crave, even though those things are different from each other, you will discover that they share in common that we find ourselves craving the things that hurt us, even though we shouldn't, in theory, if we're healthy, whole organisms. And it's the same way with tragedy. So I haven't gotten to an actual arche yet. I'm going to talk about one shortly. But what I'm doing so far is setting the stage by talking about the scent and flavor of them, because they are infinities of infinities, because they're infinite things that manifest themselves in infinite variety. It means that it's easier for us to get the scent or flavor of them than it is for us to describe them clearly and define them. They don't lend themselves to Verstand definitions, but they do lend themselves to art. And that's why I'm glad you're here today, Phil. They lend themselves to art, the artist's sense, right, of the recognition of patterns and the deeper patterns under things is one of the ways that you sense the presence of archai when you're searching for them. You got your hand up, so go ahead.
Yeah, well, I could understand how an individual could behave this way, but insofar as, let's say, me as an individual also live in society, and I owe a debt, or at least a compassion for others.
Yes.
Must live in the society. Then you must also answer the question: how do you make it so that you could actually move society, which are full of very vulnerable people,
Yes.
into that state? Because remember Oedipus, when we first mentioned Oedipus, I defended him.
Yes.
Because he was able to, in a sense, transcend that boundary and become a Zen master. Okay.
Oedipus at Kalana.
Yeah, but unfortunately, he left the world as it is.
Yes.
And his daughter ended up dying in the society in which he left behind because he was incapable or unwilling or whatever reason to go and transform it back to this new reality.
Yes.
And so insofar as you at least have compassion for people who are less willing to live this life,
yes,
then in a sense, where does your responsibility lie in terms of like bringing them along so that they could also exist, at least, if not out of the city, at least at the gates of the city.
yes.
So that, because otherwise, you could just be a sage out on the mountain,
yes,
like in a funny way,
benefits.
cut off from the rest of us who must live in the world. I'll give you another example. Another example that's not quite that, but during the Communist Revolution, Zhou Enlai, who was a foreign student, I think France, came back to the revolution because they believe in the revolution because China was in a lot of trouble. Okay.
Yes.
And for a while, he actually struggled for the leadership. And then he stepped aside because he realized the leader needed to be somebody from the common class. And so he let Mao become the leader. Okay. But he was always clever. And I think partly because he did that, Mao trusted him as somebody who really believed in the system.
Mhm.
However, later on, after the revolution, in a sense, on one sense, was over, China was developing into a economy, okay, with Liu Shaoqi. Okay, of course, he got purged
Yes.
because Mao had an ego. So the question I have is like, he was never purged, and I think Zhou Enlai saved China because he knew was falling into a perpetual revolution, not the wrong kind, but perpetual revolution. And the question I asked in a graduate seminar on art was, at what point does modernism, which is a rebel to the structure of society, understand that there is a provisionary government, and then when the revolution over transformed into a real government to actually govern rather than leave the thing in display. And Zhou Enlai did that, and China survived. If he hadn't done that, it would have gone into remain in this chaos of continual revolution. So not that he's doing the same thing as you are saying, but he was actually trying to straddle the thing between revolution and a stable society, because that's how China remained for 5,000 years, a stable society. So that's a very difficult task to transform your own vision into something that will work for society as a whole.
You know, you have that same gift that Sharon has for saying, I'm just going to ask this question. I mean, it might not be right on subject, but I'm just going to ask this question. And it turns out the question goes right to the roots of the problem. That's Phyllis, the perfect question you've asked. To answer your question, we have to finish the discussion we're having, because the answer to the question is mythos culture. Mythos culture was created specifically to solve that problem. And that's a problem that logos culture does not solve and cannot solve because of the nature of Verstand. Mythos culture solves it because of the nature of Vernunft, because Vernunft can translate between the infinitizing and the finitizing. Without that translation, all the gains that any individual person might have made as a Vernunft thinker are lost upon their death. And so mythos culture is the way that whatever breakthroughs are made get reincorporated back into the culture in a way that can be comprehended not just by Vernunft thinkers, but also by Verstand thinkers and Begriff thinkers, so that the entire society can harmonize around the new insights. And it's a serious problem. It's in many ways the single most important problem of human history, is threading the needle between the finite and the infinite in a way that can build up momentum over time and make progress. Because without that, it's not just running in the sand, but you can backslide all the way to a culture that doesn't even allow for the infinite or Vernunft and insists on holding everybody down to the basal metabolism of the mind, as Kenneth Smith calls Begriff and Verstand, which is where we find ourselves in a kind of hyper-reductionistic state in which we never get to grow into full human beings. We're kept in this infantilized state so that we'll consume, so that we're always anxious and hungry and we'll spend money. But we'll come back to that. It means that there's not a short answer, but there's a long answer. And that long answer is kind of the whole point of Kenneth Smith's philosophy, is building upon Hegel and Kierkegaard and Arendt and others in that direction. So thank you for that. Sharon, welcome.
Hi. Yes.
You has a question.
It's two-part. I have a comment, then I have a question.
Shoot.
So I'm making sure that I am staying with the discussion. Yes. And there's this part in the essay, and I think we're still discussing number 3, myth, art, and dreams, right?
Yeah.
Because I am listening to what you said, and I found this very relevant. It says, for Heraclitus, truth remains. Character, our distinctive preferences, predispositions, blind spots, strengths, vices, etc. It's fate. It's still the ultimate and undecisive faith. Character is the specific instrument through which we are woven into the patterns of necessity that
Yes.
make up the tapestry of mankind, the stuff of tragedy and epic, the cultural constellations of history, the waxing and waning of civilization orders. So I see life as like the weaving of a tapestry. And so there's Begriff, there's Verstand, there's Vernuft, and that tapestry has got different hues, different textures.
Yes.
There are threads of different lengths. And we not only weave our own individual tapestry, our individual tapestries lends itself to the weaving of a societal tapestry.
That's right.
And that word, that Kenneth Smith tapestry, just triggered all kinds of possibilities and explanations in my mind, because that's what I see this as. And not everybody decides to use all the threads in the tapestry to do something creative. Others don't. But
Right.
that's part of the mystery of life, or the wonderfulness, or it's not necessarily tragic, it's just the variety.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and this is once there you go again, Sharon. this is the pivotal, sentences in this essay that tie what we've been talking about for the last few weeks to the subject matter of this book, which is, how is it that mythos culture and logos culture are reflections of the way that our different mental faculties can grow into being modes of character, which can grow into being modes of culture, which can turn into epochs of time when certain kinds of cultures predominate. And, so many of the things that we struggled with over the last 2,500 years are things that Heraclitus already pointed the way to the problems and the solutions. But he did it in a way that we can't understand now because we don't think of the world or ourselves the way that he did. And so his words, we read them the way we would mean them if we were to say them, and thus we miss the meaning of what he's saying. When you talk about the weaving here, again, you're putting your finger right on a hot point, because, with the ancient Greeks, when we're talking about character, and character is fate specifically, we start talking about weaving, we're talking about the fates, right? We're talking about, the three women who weave everybody's lives, and who weave all the lives together into the tapestry of human history. And the Greeks believed that those three chthonic deities, those three fates, were older and deeper than the Olympian gods, and older and deeper than the Titans who preceded them. And the only deities who were older or deeper than they was Ananke herself, necessity, who they were servants of. And so that idea that we need to weave the whole from diversity, from diverse threads, is one of the things that is an essential part of Kenneth Smith's philosophy, but that when you explore it, it can lead to very uncomfortable discussions, because he's basically saying that not only are Begriff, Verstand, and Vernunft different from each other, but they're all necessary. And they're all better at different things. They're not equals. It's a kind of diversity in which it's like, who's better? If we start asking questions about who's better, like is a doctor is a doctor better than a fireman? And the answer ends up being that it's an unanswerable question, because it depends. Is your house on fire right now? Because if it is, which one is better for you right now, which one you desperately need. But if you've got an injury or an illness and your house is not on fire, then you know which one you desperately need. This idea of different and not equal, but still valuable, but valuable in different ways and not the same way, requires Vernunft type thinking to fully come to terms with. As long as we try to reduce everything to a number or a simple equality, like Verstand wants to do, we can't understand what the diversity of human beings is for, why we have it. Why does nature abhor a monoculture? Why does nature always want multiple species to be involved in the same ecosystem, and within each species to have multiple variations going on at the same time? Why doesn't it just stamp us all out the same way? Why doesn't it just find the best human being and make everybody that kind of human being? And of course, what we discover in biology is that there is no best. Our circumstances are always changing. We can't predict what we're going to need in the future. And the species that last are the ones that have a nice wide distribution of possibilities, so that somebody in there is going to be able to handle whatever it is that comes up next, even if it's somewhat obscure, someone who's not dominating right now because they're not as useful to our current circumstances. Go ahead, Sharon.
Well, I want to respond to that. The way I view it, I don't think there's any good, better, best. If you view human beings as you're on a spiritual journey and you're engaging in a spiritual evolution, and discipline, namely your job that you've taken to make your contribution, so long as you do it to the very, very best of your ability, and I don't know how to say this in philosophical terms, then there is no good, better, best. Wherever you are, if you're the best at whatever level you are, then that's all it requires.
Yeah, it's like Sisyphus, right? The point is to push the boulder. The point isn't where you are on the hill. The point is the journey, the effort,
correct,
the striving. Because wherever we are is some finite place, but the process of striving to do better is infinite. So it's superior. It's the striving that matters. It's the trying. Yeah, I'm with you on that. That's a very Greek perspective. And so this makes sense so far. So what we come around to then is this idea that where the doulos puts Begriff as the master and makes Verstand be the servant, and reality isn't even hardly part of the picture. And where the Banausos makes Verstand the master and makes Begriff the servant, and once again, reality is just a combination toolbox and larder, but has no meaning, no normative value. What Vernunft does different from either of them is that it makes both Begriff and Verstand the servants. And it puts actuality to the best of its ability. It strives. It doesn't finish. It doesn't achieve it. I mean, you can achieve a Begriff state. You can achieve a Verstand state. You can become a doulos and be a doulos. You can become a Banausos and be a Banausos. But you can never become or be an Aristos. You can only strive to be an Aristos, and that striving is the eristic state. And the reason is, as we said earlier, the challenge of the actual cosmos is that it's infinities upon infinities, full of details, very confusing, hard to sort out what the source of truth or meaning or right or wrong is supposed to be. There's too much going on. It's like people are constantly yelling at you while you're trying to solve a problem. With Begriff, you know the answer because you feel the answer, you've experienced the answer. And with Verstand, you know the answer because you've learned the answer, or you can deduce the answer, you can calculate the answer. It's the brain has designed itself so that truth and meaning and right and wrong are easy to access through Begriff and Verstand. The problem is they're wrong. They're easy, but they're wrong. They're finitizing, so they're guaranteed to be incomplete at a minimum. And they could be way off beyond that. But with Vernunft, you are constantly striving to get outside of the trap of the brain. You're striving to search reality for the simpler, deeper frames of reference that you can use to answer questions of truth, meaning, and right and wrong. And unlike the other two modes of thought, you're never going to have them as a source. You're always going to be searching for them as a source and approximating them. And so it is not that the Vernunft uses Archai as the master. It's that it uses the search for Archai as its mastery, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does.
So let's see if I can qualify a little bit more. So we've talked about the flavor of Archai. We've talked about examples of infinitizing things. I want to, we talked about the idea of teleology and telos, intent built into all of matter, that all of matter also contains form. It contains spirit. It is all striving to become something and to transform itself into whatever it is it's going to transform to be. And that the actual outcomes don't only depend upon its own teleology, but the meeting and resolution of all the teleologies it encounters as it tries to unfold itself while they unfold themselves. They unfold together and they create a new whole that's different from what any of them could have done. This is a question of intent. Before I get to the next question, I'll call on Phil. Go ahead, Phil.
Yeah, I still object in part in this sense. Yes, that is what we want, okay? So I agree with that part. However, human beings are finite. And
Yes.
we know that in research, in terms of even nature, certainly of human beings, that it needs rest.
Yes.
Okay. So
Yes.
you have to build within the system of an effort to constantly search at least way stations
Yes.
in which you could pause a moment, not so much that you're happy with what's already there, but rest so that you could then proceed. Otherwise, you are in a sense a kind of a god or demigod already, because you don't need rest. You just
Yes.
need continual motion. And human beings, by our own limitation, because we're finite individuals, cannot be constantly in motion. We have to have a state of rest. And I think I wonder about that, because, like, some people need more than others, but
Yes.
nonetheless, we all need it to a certain degree. And nature has built that into us, because being at rest sometimes is a very dangerous thing, and yet we all do it. I mean, even sharks have one eye open while they're sleeping, but they're at rest. They're not fully going for it.
Yeah, that's right.
So you have to build that within the system. We have vacations, for instance, or we should have vacation. We have weekends, whatever, so that you could, rest up and rebuild your body. Because now even bodybuilders know that constantly on the pumping iron is not going to do it.
That's right.
You have to have rest in order to rebuild.
Kenneth Smith agrees with you 100%.
Okay, good.
He has in his book Webs, he has this parable called The Maven Out of Tune. And I'll read it for anybody who might be on the phone. A maven of surpassingly nimble mind moved his mediation practice to a city where his sublime insights were well received. His diagnoses and verdicts captured unforeseen and exactly apt aspects of situations no one had thought of. In spite of demand, he was only available on certain days. No one had the effrontery to ask why he worked so erratically. One week, a cousin of his came on business from the hamlet where they'd grown up, and the subtle master was pleased to accommodate him. The next morning, after news of families at home, the expert went briefly to his dresser, caught his own image in the clouded old mirror there, and sent word that he could not be mediating disputes that day. His cousin was abashed. What could you have seen that told you not to ply your mind today? People are lined up. Yes, because they trust the balance and acuity in my intuitions. Today, I know not to trust my own scales that show me the equivalence between disparate things. And why is that? The hair at my right temple eddies the wrong way. His cousin's jaw hung agape. Because your hair is wild, you disappoint these people? The maven looked sympathetically at him. That is why I so seldom explain these things. It's not what I'm looking at, but what I'm looking with. My mind is trying to tell me it is disturbed by the wrong kinds of things today. It must lie fallow for a while. And this is Kenneth's way of saying in parable form, the brain needs rest. You can't engage in Vernunft all the time. Vernunft is a tricky business. It's a matter of delicate taste. You have to use all your senses and your Begriff and your Verstand. You have to use everything at your disposal to try to sense out the subtle archai that are hiding. Nature loves to hide, says Heraclitus. Heraclitus says, the Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither reveals nor conceals, but gives signs. So we have to be subtly watching for the evidence of the deeper truths of things. And that requires of us to be sensitive and not to be too worn out. And when we get worn out, we start to be distracted by the wrong things. And that's the sign, right? Our Vernunft capabilities break down and we find ourselves responding to things in a Begriff or Verstand way. Because unlike Begriff and Verstand, Vernunft isn't a state that you achieve and hold. It's a state that you work for. And you can only work for it when you've got the capacity and haven't worn yourself out. So Phil, you're right on the money. This is another one of the things that distinguishes Vernunft from the other two. It is a special kind of wearying, and you can only do it when your brain is right. And that's only going to be sometimes. And the rest of the time, you got to rest, and you got to nourish yourself, and you got to take care of yourself so that you can regrow your capacity to do Vernunft again. It comes and goes. There's a reason why people talk about aha experiences and why the Buddhists talk about enlightenment as satori. It comes upon you suddenly. And you're not satoriing all the time because the brain couldn't possibly sustain that. It has moments, transcendent moments. And then what you try to do is harvest the fruits of those transcendent moments and get as much out of them as you can while you're recuperating and waiting for your next moment. Sharon, go ahead.
I just wanted to comment that physiologically, we have a period of rest built in.
Yes.
Mind, body, and spirit. So it's a circadian rhythm. And you can see that in nature. There's day and night. But modern man runs afoul of that rhythm. And that's when we get stressed. And that's when we make bad decisions and poor decisions. We don't develop any insight.
Right.
I think that's what you're trying to say.
I am. Yeah.
That's what I'm hearing.
That's exactly right. And, sometimes what we need is rest, and sometimes what we need is stimulation outside of the ruts we usually stay in, because the ruts we stay in are wearying as well. Heraclitus has a line about that too, where he says it's wearying to always be working at the same kind of thing. You have to mix it up. You have to try different things. And so we go on vacations to get new experiences that are different from the experiences we've had before, or we go learn some new subject to give our Verstand something new to chew on. We're sometimes we're trying to withdraw and relax, and sometimes we're trying to feed the faculties of our mind in different ways. And all of these things together at different times are necessary to rebuild the potential for satori, so that we can engage in Vernunft for a while. It's tricky. It's tricky business. But what's interesting about it is that even though it's tricky, people have been doing it. People have been documented doing it for thousands of years. And the Buddha basically documented one or more experiences of satori that he had and built a whole religion out of trying to help people achieve that state more often. What do you have to do with your mind in order to clear the way for moments of Vernunft? That's and people who work in the creativity industry, likewise, are struggling with the same thing. What do you have to do differently from the way we usually meet and organize our lives in order to increase your capacity to be creative? And every artist struggles with this. It's like, when can you be creative and when can you not be creative, and what are the conditions? And what you discover is creativity, the capacity for Vernunft, is another example of the infinitizing and yet concrete at the same time. Because what you need to recharge your satori batteries is different from what somebody else needs to recharge their satori batteries. Some new experience that might be hugely stimulating for you might be their everyday experience. And if they did it, it wouldn't help them at all. That might be exactly what they need to get away from. And a third person might just be tired and need a rest. It's like it manifests differently, even though it's the same phenomenon that is infinite in the sense that it affects all of us. In each of us, it expresses itself individually. And that's what we mean about the concrete universal of Vernunft. This is the infinity of infinities. It's not just everywhere, it's different everywhere at the same time that it's the same everywhere. It's a paradox. And that's the scent, right? That's how we know we're on the trail. It's got the paradoxes, it's got the infinitude, but it's got the concreteness of the way it expresses itself. These are some of the symptoms that we're in the presence, where we may not be looking directly at it, and we almost never are because we don't know where to look, but that we're at least in the neighborhood or the presence of one of these archai, because we can smell it, The pattern is there. So in a little bit, I'm going to have to take a break like I did last Monday so my kitty can get her next dose of drugs. The keeper is going to come be here in about 10 minutes or so. And when that does, I'll step away and leave you guys to talk, and then I'll be back about 10 minutes after that. But this is fair warning. So the next thing to talk about before I talk about the next arche, before I talk about my first example of an arche, the next thing to talk about is another example of something that interpenetrates everything, and that's intelligence. In the modern world, we believe intelligence is conscious. It's something the brain does. If we're willing to acknowledge the idea of unconscious intelligence, we still say it must be something the brain does. We just say it's something the brain does unconsciously. But whether it's done consciously or unconsciously, we assert that intelligence can only come from a brain. And that leaves us in a difficult position. It leaves us in a difficult position. Because why is it that so many very intelligent people can do such stupid things, first of all? Right? I mean, if intelligence is innate and measurable and fixed and definable, like height, then how can you be a smart person and do stupid things? Shouldn't smart people do smart things and stupid people do stupid things? And yet that's not how it manifests at all in us, right? So we have a problem with attributing it all to the brain, right? Smart brains can do dumb things. But also, more profoundly, why is it that the biosphere as a whole, without any brain at all, over billions of years, has evolved this amazingly hyper-balanced, hyper-intricate, constantly changing, infinitizing, and yet harmony-seeking system that works when there's hardly anything human beings can make that lasts more than a generation or two, if that long? How long does it take my toaster to break? How long before my laptop breaks? How long before my car breaks? The things people make with all their brilliance and ingenuity seem awfully stupid by comparison with the things that nature makes without any brain at all. And yet we insist that it's wrong to use the word intelligent for what nature's doing by itself without any brains, and that we must use intelligence to describe what we're doing with our brain, even when it's completely stupid. So as moderns, because we live in a Verstand flatland world, all the words have been redefined to mean things that reinforce the current order. We basically cannot explain why it is that the universe coheres into a whole. Why does it harmonize? We look at things like the dolphin, the tuna fish, and the ichthyosaurus evolved that same streamlined shape that's ideal for swimming very fast through the water, even though they all evolved it independently from predecessors that didn't have that shape. And nobody sat down at a drafting board to design that shape, right? This wasn't conscious design. And yet it wasn't random either. They all zoomed in on the same design. There's a kind of intelligent conversion that happens when there's incremental, iterative weeding out processes going on generationally that allows very, very intelligent things to happen without any actual brain-based intelligence occurring. And because of that, if we adopt the archaic perspective, if we set aside for a moment the modernist insistence that none of that's intelligent, and we adopt an archaic perspective, then without ever saying that there's any kind of world mind, we can still say that there is intelligence in everything that exists, right? The tree has a brilliant design, even though it was never designed. And setting aside all the things we've learned about, the intelligence of trees working together in a forest, even without that, just the way that it reaches towards the light and uses its leaves to collect nutrition from the sun is brilliant. I wish I could do that. I wish I could just reach my hand out towards the sun and be fed, right? That's brilliant. Why do I have to run around killing and eating things? That's remarkably stupid. As a design, there's all kinds of problems with that, like the infliction of cruelty upon other living things built in as a kind of stupidity to my life cycle. And yet, the tree isn't deciding that it wants to reach out to the sun with its leaves. It might be deciding how exactly and where and when and whether it shares it with other trees. There might be some kind of, root based subterranean intelligence like they're discovering that's involved. But still, that's nothing like simply saying, what would be a smart idea? I think I'll just reach my arms up and grow some leaves and get some food from the sun. That doesn't happen. So that it has a different kind of intelligence. And it's got a lot of it. There's a lot of intelligence to the way that it grows and lives compared to a lot of other life choices, such as the way many people live. There are many things about the way we live that are not sustainable, that are self-harmful, they're just not smart as individuals and as a civilization.
I've wondered, can I say something real quick?
Go ahead, Ginny.
It's just, for many years, I've thought of Venus flytrap.
Yes.
How does it know, when other than feeling it, something flying around near it to trap its fly? To me, that is form of intelligence,
Right.
Like you said about trees and all that. And so,
yeah.
At what point do we call one thing intelligence and not? That's right. It's as far as I'm concerned, plant life is quite intelligent.
Yeah. So this is why, the archaic Greeks would agree with you. They'd say this is why it's not useful to talk about only brains as having intelligence, only organisms as having life, only people as having intent. It's more useful to start with the assumption that everything is alive, even rocks. They just aren't alive in a, organism kind of way. And that everything has intent, even though it doesn't involve a brain. It's got teleology. Its molecules are going to try to do something. Its structures are going to try to do something. It's going to act out in the world, and that everything has intelligence. Even though, again, it's not brain-based intelligence, we have to redefine the word. We're finding all these fundamental words we use to identify who we are as people are better if we don't define them that way. We get a better ability to describe the cosmos and why it is the way it is if we loosen up these definitions and apply them to, if we get to the point where we're able to say there is an intelligence, even though no brain's involved and no spirit in the supernatural sense, but there's an intelligence to the way that the path of a stream is formed down a mountainside. It leads back to the ocean as a result of the rain. The interaction of the rain and the landscape is intelligence, and it resolves certain problems in a way that works and that's sustainable. Joseph and then Phil. We'll see if I get interrupted at some point through this.
Actually, in a way, you can skip me because I was just going to ask you to clarify what you meant by intelligence, and you
Yes.
just did, and you really just did that. So
yes,
because like intelligence, had so many different meanings, especially and to limit it even just to the mind and combining it with nature actually makes a lot of sense to me. I even define it as virtue sometimes, because that's in accordance with nature in a way. So anyway, but thank you.
My pleasure. Before I call on Phil, one place that we see these problems is when we read James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, that the biosphere of the planet as a whole acts kind of like an organism, in that it is constantly adjusting itself to try to keep air composition and pressure and moisture and other things within limits that permit life to exist. And that in doing that, it's sort of functioning like our own biological systems that are trying to keep our blood pressure and our heart rate and our blood sugar and all these other things within limits. And the problem is it can be true at the same time that what we don't mean is that it's one big animal, right? It's like it's possible for something not to be an organism as classically defined by biology and still be alive, but only if we change our definition of life to be more encompassing until it's able to describe these other things that are clearly not one organism and yet have many of the qualities of living systems, their ability to reinforce themselves and to protect themselves. And so when we talk about archae, we're going to run up against this problem, that all of the key terms we would use to describe what they are and how they interact with us and everything in the world, every one of them has this problem that terms like intent and intelligence and life have, that they've been defined for us in verstant ways that preclude the possibility that archae could even exist. So all the words we would use to try to describe an archae this would be a misapplication of those Verstand definitions. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, your example of the tree triggers something in me that is kind of interesting. It's an interesting example. I guess partly because of Euclid, we see the three dimensions of space, right? We know 2D, 1D, 2D, 3D, okay? And it's only lately that we recognize that there's actually a 2.5D. We don't have to go to 4D, 2.5D. And in a sense, that is because the tree is able to see the half. You could say, well, you could define that still as 3D. You just go in further and that space becomes 3D, okay? But it's the process, it moves from one 3D to another 3D that allows it to have that half, because if it's a tree grows solid, it's not so good.
Right.
I mean, that all the leaves would cover every other leaves.
Right.
And so therefore you wouldn't get the maximum nutrition. But because they're aware of where other leaves are, they're weaving in the sense in the 2.5, in that half space in between that, it's just kind of like, just like Bartok discover, the in-between notes.
Yes.
It's like, so even if we restricted the 3D, we don't pay enough attention. The same way when we move into a space, we know that a room is 3D again, even though you look at a building, it's contain everything inside. But when we move through a room, we're aware of the 2.5D, so we don't bump into chairs and other things. So
Yes.
It becomes a dynamic process rather than like a defined static process, right? So I think that's kind of interesting that we could actually discover dimensions within dimensions, not even
Yes.
outside of dimensions, but
Yes.
inside dimensions that in a sense that we have not paid attention to because we simplify it into 3D, right?
Yeah, that's
and
right.
It defines everything. So you're right that the dynamic process transforms a static process, because even a static process, you have to move through the static in order to liberate the interior space.
That's right. Thank you for that, Phil. Excellent example. James, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this really offers a solution to the what's called the hard problem of consciousness. Because if the trees are conscious, if the trees have this kind of intelligence, then and they have a kind of maybe they also have a kind of a consciousness, right? If it's intelligence, right? Because how do you define what consciousness is, right?
Yeah.
So we have this kind of intelligence, and where does that come from, right? And we have what we don't understand. It's this hard problem of consciousness. And we try to locate it within the brain or something, or
Right.
or no, that doesn't make sense either, right?
Right.
It's not within the brain. So it has to be, because our intelligence has to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah.
Our brains have to come from somewhere, and so we have to link it back to nature itself. So
the idea that the brain is not the original source of intelligence, but is trying to simulate something
right,
that already exists elsewhere.
Right.
Interesting, right?
Right. So that makes consciousness a lot less difficult to understand, because you can just link it back to this idea of panpsychism, which is that our consciousness is really not separate from the nature's intelligence of trees and plants and everything else, right?
Right.
It's part of one. It's part of a single unit.
I'm going to be back in 10 minutes.
Consciousness. Yeah.
You guys carry on without me until then.
All right, thank you. So how'd you like that discussion this morning, Phil?
It wasn't so participational, so I didn't like it as much, but nonetheless, it was interesting. He talked about philosophy, how particularly, I think he's more of a literary guy, but he talked about all of the arts to a certain degree, how it relates to philosophy. But then he also understands that other parts of it, in a sense, is not quite philosophy. And the point he made was that there are, I think that's what he said, but I'm not sure because I didn't get it asked a question, was that there are realms of understanding, or maybe you could call to the way of understanding, that understanding cannot define, okay? And so therefore artists, in a sense, know that there's something urgent in the world or in society and something in which you want to illustrate. He brought up Othello. He says the reason why Othello was an understanding of jealousy, how that proceeds in the human mind. But he said, but that was superior to than just merely a kind of descriptive example of one single person, like, you know, like a psychiatrist analyzing that person. It has to be unfolded in such a way that it becomes sort of universal, at least within a culture, that go beyond the individual biography of the individual, because then if it's just merely an individual, just as like Othello, the guy, just remains so jealous of Thessalmonia, then it wouldn't be useful for others. But when you are able to, in a sense, find out it's important, and you could sort of see how that resides in all of us, then it becomes more universal. But it can't be described in a kind of alternatively analytical form that is so concrete that it cannot be talked about. So he said literature in that sense is dealing with actually urgent philosophical principles that, in a sense, that our philosophy can get at, because it doesn't have a definition, a clear and distinct definition. I thought that was a very interesting idea, that you know, that there is this sort of half measure that, in a sense, is providing a kind of a clearing that allows you to at least perceive what the situation is in a way, rather than just a definition of what it is. So that was interesting.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, I agree with that.
he really made kind of the hero of artists in general, because they brought out this dimension which you could, in a sense, begin to engage in very important issues without diving into philosophy, which is so definitional in a way.
Is this the meeting, philosophy art, that Darren hosted? Is that the one you went to?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know who it is, but it's
No, it's
I think it's Robert Pippin. That
yeah,
was
Oh, yeah. Okay.
yeah,
yeah.
philosophy.
So you actually had a guest speaker? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, that was Robert Pippin, I think.
Is it on Meetup?
It was on Meetup, but it was on a meetup that was hosted in London by the Philosophical Society or something.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
been around since 1923. So
Oh, wow.
it was real hard to get into. I registered, and when I went in there, and then it asked me to register again. You know, it's like I almost kind of gave up on it.
Oh.
So,
It was like a
so it might have excluded a lot of people who wanted to be in it. So
Sounds interesting.
What
it
did
was
they
like
say?
only about 1 hour. It was 1 hour exactly.
Yeah,
It didn't
that's
last
right.
2 hours.
Oh, wow.
What was the main point he made about philosophy and art?
I thought it was that philosophy does rely on art to describe what could not be, you describe what is known but could not be described, and that's what literature does.
Mhm.
It describes, in art, what we know, but it has to be put into some image or in words. And so it kind of relates back to what Kenneth Smith's idea of myth, and Kenneth Smith includes literature, mainly literature, as mythos,
Yeah.
and it's part of philosophy.
Well, here is what Kenneth Smith is saying. He says, art is the lancet of a higher truth, a law superior to any of man's pleasant reasonings.
Right, right.
That's what Kenneth Smith says about it. That's why I asked what else this meetup added.
Yeah.
Well, it relates to what I've said before. There are things that you should speak about, and there are things you can't speak about. You can only point to. Essentially, that's what art is. You know it's there. You can't actually say it clearly, but you could certainly point to it, and everybody recognize there is something there that needs to be understood in some way.
Yeah, and a philosopher can use that, rely on that for building their concepts. Concepts are more abstract, and the artist puts maybe puts those abstractions knowledge into concrete images or ideas.
Although he doesn't go as far as Kenneth Smith that philosophy somehow also constrains possibilities. He actually does still hold philosophy as a higher standard. In other words, art points you there. It's not so clear, but that's the way it has to be because that's just the way things are. But if we could get it clearer and state it as a philosophical principle, then that's even better. He doesn't say that somehow when you get up there, it constrains the way you're thinking because the reduction in the fullness of the thing begins to also reduce the possibility of what it is. He doesn't go that far. He really is a philosopher in a way, even though he's a philosopher art.
Yeah. Sort of like what Hegel, Hegel just began his philosophy by saying that from religion, and he's putting religion into concepts and perhaps even understanding art, into higher concepts that are what he calls what we call philosophy. But he also had critiques Hegel and compares Hegel to Kant. He says that Hegel doesn't settle down enough to really appreciate art for what it is, whereas Kant, with his notions of judgment and so forth, are more in tune with truly understanding art, appreciating art.
No, I thought he criticized Hegel in a different way. I thought he criticized Hegel because he doesn't allow art to have its own power enough that is somehow tied to the movement of society in general. So therefore, art is subsumed to a degree under the general movement of culture, you could say, whereas art in its distinct way through each distinct discipline has its own, in a sense, perception that, in a sense, enlightened in a different way. So you have to have the sensitivity beyond a cultural movement to appreciate art for what it is, because in some ways, at least in modernist art, is resistant to being subsumed entirely in a cultural movement. In other words, it's insistent to be always revolutionary, is different than just sort of something that somehow eventually gets subsumed under culture in general. Because it's always ahead of, in a way, ahead of culture to a certain degree. That's what he claims.
Did you agree with how he understood or explained what modern abstract art and music was? That there was a resistance to the consumerist culture.
That's right, to the market forces. Except he does say finally it fails because it actually does get, in a sense, bought off. In other words, it gets exhausted by the market structure in the final analysis.
You think that was what happened to Andy Warhol?
Yeah, I think so. I actually have an interesting story about Andy Warhol, which may be a myth rather than a reality, but it's so authentic to what he is that it's actually more real than Andy Warhol himself. I'll tell it to you someday if we have time.
Well, since I at one time bought a work from Kenneth Smith, have I sort of corrupted his philosophy? Since I actually purchased a print of his.
Dave, could I ask David a question? David Roel.
Is he there?
Yeah, go ahead.
You're recording the session that Rick is doing, right? How do I find it if I wanted to watch it or listen to it? Is it on YouTube? And what is the link? Or how do I find it? Do I just type in philosophy meeting with David Roel, Rick Marshall, or how do I go about finding it?
Ginny, it's on David Roel's YouTube channel. You can find that by his name.
Oh, David Roel's YouTube channel? Okay.
There's the link.
Oh, great. Thanks, David.
Maybe you could find it through The Philosopher, which is I guess, a webinar of the publication, The Philosopher, established since 1923. Let me see if I have it. Well, there's an email address, but that might just direct you to the organization rather than the seminar.
Well, David has put a link in the chat. So
okay, good.
Yeah, so just capture it out of there and you'll have that.
Correct.
All right. We ready to dive back into Archive?
Yeah, we were lost without you.
I don't believe that for a moment.
Oh, we were completely lost. We were talking about all kinds of now.
Yeah, really.
So what's it? So we've talked about examples of things that are like Archive. We've talked about tragic inversion, how it's different in every person. We've talked about the wanting the wrong things that Heraclitus talks about and how it's different in every person. It's everywhere, but different everywhere. It's an infinity of infinities. It's a concrete universal instead of an abstract universal in Hegel's terms. But now let's actually talk about one of these. We've talked about intent and how that reflects in things. Teleology. The concept of teleology is very close to anarche. The idea that everything is the seed of its future self, that it is progressively unfolding new forms of order and becoming other than it is, and that it has this kind of non-brain-based intent to act out and become whatever it's going to become, and that where it ends up is the interaction of that and everything else, is very much in the vicinity of some arche. And the same is true of this idea of intelligence, that we never find completely random things on Earth. On Earth, we only find things that have grown into the larger whole and become part of it, so that there is an intelligence to the way that their individuality, whether it's their shape or it's their physiology or what have you, is compatible with the larger whole that they find themselves a part of. And that those compatibilities aren't just they didn't happen to run into a problem. They're often intricate interrelationships with other things. So we've talked on these before, right? About the fungi and the trees in a forest and the hyphae and the roles that they play. Is everybody clear on that? Would anybody like a refresher on that? Or are we all good on that? Because when I was a little kid, everybody thought that fungi in forests were infections.
Yeah.
No.
Refresh.
So you want a refresher, Joseph?
Yeah, please. If everybody else is, it's up to everybody
Yes, I'll support you on that one, Joseph. I'll take the refresher too.
Sure. So when I was a kid, we had a Verstand idea of a forest. We thought a forest is a place with a lot of trees. If it has a lot of trees, then it's a forest. And so Weyerhaeuser and other logging companies were very concerned with the health of the trees. And their idea of a healthy forest is something that has a lot of trees and doesn't have anything else. And they might tolerate squirrels or bushes as long as they didn't seem to be interfering with the trees. But if it was saplings, then they would kill all the bushes and only let there be saplings. And among the things that they definitely wouldn't tolerate was they did not like insects. They used insecticides widely to try to kill off all the insects. And they hated fungi. They said, the fungi are infecting our trees. It's gross. They penetrate the wood and contaminate it, and they make it sick. So they used fungicides widely in these tree farms to try to kill off all the fungi. Lo and behold, what do we discover? But a forest is not as much like the Verstand idea of a forest as we thought it was. It is not a place that is full of pure trees. Instead, it's like a lichen. You guys know about lichens?
Mhm.
So a lichen isn't a species. There's no such thing as a species of lichen. A lichen is 3 or more different organisms that need each other to become a lichen. And it includes an algae and a bacteria and a fungi at a minimum. And that's what makes lichens, is the 3 of them together make a plant. What we have thought forever was a plant turns out to be, it's a colony. And specifically, it's a colony of unlike things that need each other to complete each other to become the whole. So it turns out forests are lichens in this sense, because forests actually need the fungi to infect them. They need the hyphae of the fungi to penetrate their roots. And if they don't, the trees don't grow as well as the forests in which they do. And now we finally know what the reason is. It's clear what we've been screwing up all this time, why we didn't see this right. It's because trees are very good at getting water and at producing food with their leaves, but they're not so good at soaking up all the minerals that they need. That turns out to be something roots aren't very good at. We always thought they were, but they actually aren't all that good at it. You know what's really good at it is fungi. Fungi are like little chemical factories. They're outstanding at sucking up chemicals from the soil, including minerals. Because hyphae, instead of roots, they have hyphae, which are much narrower, much thinner, and lots of them. You know, anybody who's dealt with mold has seen a lot of hyphae in action. And that's, the part of the mushroom or fungus you see above ground is tiny compared to the hyphae. The hyphae really are the fungus. The thing that we call the mushroom or fungus is just a fruit that it puts up from time to time. But it's mostly the hyphae. And those hyphae, not only, they're very good at collecting minerals, but you know what they're not good at is producing food, sugar. They're not actually very good at that. So it turns out that when the roots of the hyphae penetrate the roots of the trees, they're actually trading. The fungus is trading in minerals that the tree would otherwise have a hard time getting. And the tree is passing surplus glucose to the fungus. So both the fungus and the tree thrives, and the forest grows better than it ever would if you got rid of the fungi. We didn't know that. We thought purity is life and that contamination is death. But it turns out that's the opposite of the truth. You actually need a harmony of different things working together, combining their strengths to get a stronger whole. And this gets more interesting, like in Douglas fir forests, when you look at the Douglas squirrel, which is a squirrel that lives in the forests. And sometimes, what they like to do is they like to collect the seeds from the cones and bury them for later, right? That's how they make it through the winter. They stockpile hordes. We've all seen squirrels do this. But what most people don't know about this relationship is that the problem with this relationship is that the number of squirrels that inhabit the forest will tend to rise to the level that's required to consume all of the seeds that are available plus the ones that are buried. And this doesn't help a Douglas fir reproduce. So what the Douglas fir does is, from time to time, there are off years when Douglas firs don't produce very many cones, and the population of squirrels drops. They're still burying, right? But there aren't as many of them. And then the next year, the Douglas firs explode with cones. They produce more than the population of squirrels can ever eat. Now, the squirrels don't know that. They still try to collect and bury everything. They eat till they're full, and they bury. They bury Douglas fir seeds all over the forest. I mean, everywhere. And they cannot, no matter how smart they are, no matter how clever they are, they cannot possibly remember all of the seeds they've buried because it's a bonanza year and there's just too many for their little rodent brains. So a bunch of the seeds that the squirrels have buried grow into new Douglas fir trees on those years. And the Douglas firs go through these cycles. They always do it. And so the population of the Douglas squirrels is rising and falling in order to produce this phenomenon where there comes a year where the Douglas squirrel buries enormous numbers of Douglas fir seeds that it can't consume, which leads to the next generation of the Douglas firs growing. It's amazing.
Magic of Mother Nature.
It is, right? It's like magic. It's incredibly intelligent.
Yeah, you couldn't design that. I mean, in a way.
Just wouldn't think of it, right?
Right.
It's just too clever.
But I think what that demonstrates is the interdependence of living organisms. And when you talk about climate change, you can see where the modern man is interrupting that interdependence.
That's right.
And that's why we're having all the issues.
And we keep trying to make simple, linear, measurable systems. We don't like these systems that seem like they have chaos in them, that are unpredictable. And yet the unpredictability is a feature. Unpredictability is a predictable feature of complex, sustainable living systems. They build it in and they harness it in order to produce these pulses. And the pulses are pulses of growth. And they wouldn't be possible without the interruptions in the steadiness. So this is something that Christopher Alexander, architect Christopher Alexander, talks about in his series, The Nature of Order. He says that, patterns are one of the characteristics of living systems, but so is pattern breaking. And pattern breaking is an even more important characteristic of a living system. A pattern that is mindlessly replicated everywhere could just be some geological process, or worse, could be human beings stamping out, row after row after row of tract houses. But when you see patterns that are broken to adapt the system to local circumstances, then what you have is something that's not only capable of producing patterns, but is capable of sensing the larger whole that's being created and to modify its activities in order to better fit that larger whole. That whole forming quality is one of the key characteristics of life. And we see it everywhere in the realm of nature. Every organism does it. Every combination of organisms does it. They roll out patterns and they break those patterns. And they break those patterns in ways that allow the individuals to be better adapted to their concrete local circumstances than they would have been if they had just duplicated the pattern in a pure fashion. The classic example Christopher Alexander gives of pattern breaking is if you're building a bunch of row houses, the windows are all a certain distance from the edges of the house or from the roof or from the door. The problem is the window might be placed in a place where it's looking right into the neighbor's window or right into a wall, just based on what's around it. If you ignore what's around it and don't pay attention, then the window could be badly placed. And he says, but the worst problem is this, unlike the previous 4 houses, this one might have a spectacular view of the mountain that's not available to anybody else because it's between 2 other things. But they're only going to see it if you move the window over a little bit to the left. If you leave it where the design would have put it, they miss out on this opportunity to form a greater whole. But if you break the pattern to adjust it to something profound in the environment around you, you break the pattern and you get a better whole than you would have if you'd mindlessly stamped out the pattern. This pattern breaking thing is one of the key characteristics of life. And it's one of the things that we have a very hard time acknowledging in a Verstand culture, because in a Verstand culture, we want to mindlessly stamp things out. We think the mindless mechanical repetition is life. We say the body is a machine, even though it's the opposite of a machine. And we say that food is fuel, even though it's the opposite of fuel. I mean, when you put gas in your tank, the car doesn't build itself out of gasoline. It doesn't replace its broken parts out of gasoline. Gasoline is not food. When we eat food, we literally build ourselves out of what we're consuming. It is not just energy, it's structure that we're ingesting as well. And this capacity to restructure ourselves and to interact with the environment and to orient in the environment towards healthier and richer sources of nourishment, and to try to create long-lasting relationships with them that are sustainable, this is part of what makes us alive and not a machine. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm actually learning something different. Not that I'm ignoring what you're saying.
No, go ahead.
Is that one of the things that we believe very much in is categories, and particularly the category of the self.
Yes.
And we very much, at least in the West, certainly since the Greeks very much believe in that the self is a very, very almost sacred thing, that you don't violate that even upon death.
Uh-huh.
So now we understand, at least through modern science, that there's a large part of us not only dependent on the external environment from the self, if you want to draw an outline around us, but there's a lot of living organism within our body that in a way is not ours, that's not us, okay? Bacteria, all sorts of things. I don't know how you calculate what percentage of it is not us, it's some other living organization.
Yes.
Does that symbiotic relationship, is that now something else that we just sort of like, well, you know, we're liberal enough to just accept that, okay, like you can live as a kind of dependent species? Or is it actually in a way a part of ourselves? To what degree, when we depend on these other things, are they also part of us? Okay.
Right.
And we also know that genes have a way of evolving, and that a lot of genes and all sorts of things are what you call, in a way, defunct and useless genes, at least for the moment, because, you know, it takes time to evolve. I don't know whether they leave those genes behind because, like, you know, like that's the baggage of millions of years of old age, or is it like as a kind of backup reserve in case something should happen that you could recall again? I don't know. And so therefore, if you then extend that to the fact that it's also related to external things, such as like we need trees, we need this and that, all that, then you begin to have a different understanding of what exactly the category is. Yes. I mean, like, how we draw an outline of an individual, you know, the profile, and say, that's me.
Right.
Right. It's like, okay, I believe very much in that, by the way. So I'm speaking against myself to a certain degree because of this sort of Greek almost heritage. But you begin to understand that me is dependent on so many other things.
That's right.
That in a sense, it's like it extends beyond me. And even if you would say, well, let me at least reduce the baggage I'm carrying around, you still need at least a minimum amount to sustain yourself. And I think that's what ecology is beginning to teach us.
Yes.
And I think we need to go almost one step further, that we can't even draw a me outline. The best you could do is be an impressionist.
Yes.
And draw this fuzzy thing and say, well, I think that's me.
Yes.
I'm not so sure. So it's kind of like the fact that we have drawn hard lines against categories. It's a problem. We have to have those categories be a little bit more fuzzy and amenable to adaptation.
Exactly. Exactly. That, what you've just said, is the Vernunft critique of Verstand categories. It's like, it's not that we shouldn't have any, it's that they need to serve us and not be our masters. We need to not let the category define for us reality, but instead use it as a tool to help us understand reality. Understanding that the category will always be inadequate by comparison with whatever the truth is, because the truth is complex. We're you know, they're tools, they're helpers. If we can avoid the temptation to slip into the Verstand mind and get lost in it, you know, at which point they stop being helpers and they become our jailers. Ginny and then Sharon. Go ahead, Ginny. There you go.
You know what? I'll pass.
Okay. Fair enough. Sharon, go ahead.
You know, I wanted to answer, to kind of respond to what Phil was saying, because when I was a little girl learning biology, the first lesson we learned was the interdependence of living organisms.
Yeah.
And as in my years as a clinician, you'll see that when you give a human being massive antibiotic therapy, you sterilize the gut.
Right.
And when you sterilize the gut, you get desperately ill because you need those bacteria. And when you're ill enough and the conventional therapy doesn't work, what you do is you get a fecal transplant. So you get somebody else's bacteria and put in your gut to restore that bacterial culture so you can stay alive.
Yes. It's
so
amazing.
That's the example of that.
It's a brilliant example. We're there are 3 big domains of nature above the kingdoms so far that have been identified. There's the bacteria, there's the archaea, which tend to be extremophiles. Those are the guys that tend to live around hot springs of volcanoes and acid places and so on. But there's other reasons for their archaea as well. And then there's eukaryotes. So almost everything we think of as a living organism is a eukaryote. Plants, animals, fungi, you name it. Eukaryote cells, like we're made out of, are huge by comparison with the other two. The other two are teeny tiny little things. Eukaryotes are gigantic by comparison. So that's what sets it up to make it not bewildering that the number of cells in our bodies that don't have our DNA, that are bacteria or archaea or so on, exceeds the number of cells in our body. They're much smaller cells, and they're all lining our gut. Well, mostly lining our gut. And there's a lot of them on our skin too. And if it weren't for them, it's a lot we couldn't digest. But beyond that, we're discovering that they also modulate our mood. You can be prone to depression for the rest of your life if you nuke your bacteria in your flora. They appear to have involvement in mediating our immune system. This came out in the last couple of years. There were some studies showing that our immune response is mediated by the bacteria in our guts. In other words, it's not just our brain that's in charge of our immune system. The bacteria that aren't even our species, they aren't even our domain of life, are also in charge of our immune system, which, for the purity-minded Verstand mind, again, that's abhorrent. That's impossible. This is just not okay. But in the real world, it's not only is it okay, it's necessary, right? Because purity is death. We need to cooperate with each other. We need to help each other. Before I call on Phil, I'll give a little example of that. So there are animals that evolve that have tremendous amount of self-defense and armor on them, like turtles. There are animals that evolve that breed incredibly fast, like bunnies. But what you don't tend to find anywhere is animals that breed really fast and also defend themselves really well. And you got to ask yourself, from a Cartesian or Kantian perspective, wouldn't that be a better species? I mean, on the one hand, to be able to defend yourself would be great so you don't get eaten. And on the other, if there could be a lot of you, then you win, right? Isn't the species with the most members the most important species? That's what people keep talking about when we say, look, there's 7 billion of us and growing. Isn't more better? Don't we want, isn't the best species one that would do both of those things? But if so, why aren't there any? And the answer is because anytime they evolve, they collapse their ecosystem. Right? It might be smart, but it's not wise for a species like that to exist. So we get species that can defend themselves but breed slowly, and we get species that breed quickly but can't defend themselves, so that as part of the larger whole, they will achieve a balance, and you get a system that can survive. And as a result, both variants of species get to continue, whereas the other one doesn't because it collapses its ecosystem and goes extinct. So this is an example of a way in which, without anybody sitting down to design this thing, which they couldn't, as Joseph pointed out earlier, they couldn't have done anyway, right? We couldn't have come up with these designs. There is an enormous amount of intelligence in these complex relationships that converge upon solutions that work by process of elimination. Phil, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to put that in almost a metaphorical way. It's transferring it. What we need, in a way, is a bunch of conceptual bacteria that infect our mind, not our brain, but our mind, in order to survive. Because and the right way to live it's almost seems is to find the balance between infection of this externality
Yes.
in our mind and letting ourselves also have enough nostalgia of what we are
Yes.
to keep in balance. So the balance between nostalgia and infection of the exterior concept is how we come into a kind of a balance, right? Because
Yes.
if you are totally infected, you can't make sense of anything. You need a certain degree of nostalgia to hold on to what was in order to grow into this other thing. But if you're totally like building a border around the mind,
Right.
like what Donald Trump would want, then in a sense, it's never going to expand because you're not being infected because you're dependent on this sort of invasion of the other
That's
in
right.
order to sustain yourself and move on, right?
Right.
So that's kind of interesting, a bacteria of the mind.
Well, it's not only interesting, it's to the point. Mythos culture.
Right?
The point of mythos culture, the whole reason for mythos culture is to create a context in which even Begriff and Verstand people can act more wisely than they otherwise would have left to their own devices. And you do that by creating shared metaphors for archai that help to dramatize, emotionalize, and systematize our understanding of those archai to make them real for us. Because as long as they're not a real experience, the Begriff people can't possibly pay attention to them or care about them. And as long as they're not a coherent set of ideas systematized, the Verstand people can't care about them or pay attention to them. And yet, neither Begriff ideas nor Verstand ideas can encompass archai. And so what we need is a way to translate the the infinity of infinities of any single arche into a mythic form such that it's not only possible to care about, it's impossible not to care about it. It's deeply compelling. It strikes us emotionally, and it's unforgettable. We once we've been exposed to it, it haunts us for the rest of our lives. And because we care about it, even Begriff people will start to orient towards it. And because we build up some systems of understanding and thinking around it that are very interesting, very logically compelling, even Verstand people, once exposed to it, will go, wow, well, that's interesting. If I want to think that I'm smart, and Verstand people do, then I better memorize that and talk about it with people and think about it and see what I can deduce from it. And so you manage to create a different kind of culture in which the things that Verstand people think about and the things Begriff people think about are not just randomly whatever they would have come up with on their own, like under modernism, or worse, whatever somebody might have come up with for them in order to make them profitable to somebody else. But rather, they're lured into thinking about the things that matter, because the things that matter have been expressed in an eloquent, unforgettable, memorable, emotionally charged, intellectually fascinating way. That's a myth, not the modernist definition of a lie. But something that does that is a myth. And the reason that that's a myth is without those things, you can't have a mythos culture. And without a mythos culture, Begriff and Verstand, their tendencies spin the culture apart centrifugally and collapse it. And you lose your ability to be sustainable. You start to become a colonizer culture. You start to become self-destructive, and you start to intensify and purify the worst impulses because those two mindsets turn back on themselves and become negative feedback loops. You have to break those negative feedback loops with myths that seduce them out of themselves into looking at nature and the archai and orienting around them. Because without that, we're in serious trouble. That's what mythos culture is. And the role of Aristoi is as the people who are struggling to learn how to engage in Vernunft, they're the people who are struggling to learn how to recognize archai and to identify the things in nature that are hard to spot, but that can serve as sources of truth, meaning, and right and wrong. And then once they have spotted them, they have to figure out how to communicate them in mythic form so that they can, help to orient Begriff people and Verstand people around those things that actually matter in the world. There's a whole system of relationships and connections around this that's required in order to overcome the idiotizing reflexes of Begriff and Verstand and draw them out of themselves into a more cosmopolitan form. And for this reason, Begriff and Verstand, they're not simply good or simply bad or simply anything. They themselves are also like archai in that they can be expressed in very different ways in very different circumstances, depending on the culture in which they find themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So a Begriff-oriented person growing up in a mythic culture in which Aristoi are helping to translate archai into terms that people can understand will behave much more wisely than Begriff-oriented people who grew up under modernism, where they're basically cultivated to be exploited. Sharon and then Ginny this time. Go ahead, Sharon.
What you've just said is utterly fascinating. As I try to understand philosophy, I try to find practical concepts to which I can relate. So the varying character subtypes, Begriff, Verstand, Vermouth, Vernoof, archai, I try to look at our society today and see the areas of chaos that we have and see where those personality subtypes are. And this goes back to Phil's question where he says, what is your responsibility to bring the other people along to help them understand? And so I sat down and I was looking at some conspiracy theories, at least what I call conspiracy theories, and try to put it to this philosophical personality subtype and try to figure out how they got there.
Yes.
And I thought I wanted to bring that up today because then this introduces this whole concept of reality with a subtext of truth, right? And how this impacts our society.
Right.
You know, engaging in this mythic culture, which is getting us all so angry that we're becoming violent. And that's what I see. And the balance is not as impactful.
Yeah. Yeah, the way that we organize ourselves under modernism is designed to be useful to whoever has the power to organize us. And that has nothing to do with what's healthy or good for us or for the larger world. And so effectively, we're unhooked from the leashes that would keep us focused on doing good things and healthy things and sustainable things. And we're instead leashed to short-term purposes with long-term negative consequences that the people benefiting in the short-term figure is not their price to pay. They figure somebody else's children will have to pay those prices, and they're fine with that. They're counting on the fact that they'll have enough resources that later when the bill becomes due, it won't be their kids that have to pay it. And a subset of them don't even care if their kids have to pay it. They only care about whether they are able to achieve quarterly returns right now. And as long as they can do that, it would be fine if the whole world died, as long as it just doesn't happen right now. Because the way that they've organized people and the way that they're harnessing these impulses in people is designed according to a foreground background schema that pushes into the background all the things that really matter and pulls into the foreground things that matter only in a formal way in terms of our economy and our laws right now at this moment. It's weird, but that's what Verstand will tend to do once it's been unleashed from reality, once it's no longer hooked to archai. It becomes self-reinforcing and spins off away from reality centrifugally. Ginny, go ahead. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, I keep thinking about what you were saying earlier about squirrels and those fir trees. I think you were talking about.
Yes.
And how, all in all, what they are doing is really helping the environment, helping the earth to thrive, so to speak. Yes. And yet, human beings. There are so many human beings out there. I keep thinking of this family who are quite well-to-do, who moved into my sister's house my sister and my brother-in-law had a fairly substantial house, and they put a completely new carpeting like a year or two ago, and remodeled here and there and everywhere in the house. And these people moved in. They bought their house and completely ripped up all the carpeting because it wasn't what they wanted. And then they redid everything. The brick fireplaces, they took all the bricks down and just made everything white or something like that. Right. And I'm thinking, and they had so much stuff. They had 3 moving trucks coming from California to Austin, Texas. And I'm thinking, carbon footprint, not to mention, just because they have the money to do this or do that, they are just taking from the earth and just all what they're doing, like ripping up this brand new carpeting and just throwing out into the landfill. You know, like, why? How can we get people like that to be more aware, to be more earth conscious, to be environmentally conscious? I mean, I can't just keep thinking about this family as a small example of how human beings behave and how selfishly they behave, and so unaware of what they're doing in terms of long term. I mean, they don't think about what kind of planet they're going to leave to their children. I mean, they have children quite young age, from 2 to 10 or something like that. And yeah,
they're stuck in a culture bubble where the consequences of their actions are invisible to them. So because those consequences are invisible, they can't care about them. Yeah. They need the consequences to be made, you know, either intellectually coherent and interesting if they're Verstand people, or emotionally, experientially interesting if they're Begriff people, or most likely, it's best if the consequences are made clear both ways at the same time, since we all operate with a mix of both. If we're getting arrows pointing in the same direction from multiple different aspects of our minds, we're more likely to think, I wonder if I should go that way. Maybe I shouldn't rip up this carpet. What do you know? But if nothing is telling us that, if we're insulated from all the emotional and sensory impact, and we're isolated from all the conceptual impact, then what happens is every other possible consideration will push those aside. And so at that point, it just becomes about whatever motivates them at the moment, aesthetics, or, competing with the Joneses. The Joneses have a better looking house, I'll make mine like theirs. Yeah, there's this way in which it's not about the individual piece of information and its charge in isolation. It's about how that relates to everything else going on in the mind. And if the mind is crowded with a lot of other emotional and intellectual noise, then it's going to be very hard for the things that matter to be able to speak up enough for the brain to pay attention to them. We talked about the way that the different parts of the brain are competing for attention, and how some things you can only do if the rest of your brain is calm enough and quiet enough that the quiet voice of the important thing can be heard.
Yeah. And when my brother-in-law started telling me about, these people who are doing this and that, and I kept telling him, don't tell me. I don't want to know, what they're doing to your house.
Yeah.
It was very upsetting. Anyway.
It's one of the things. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Is there really any difference between those people and any of us? We all have wasteful tendencies in ourselves. And I think recognizing this, we can have compassion for them. And that is probably where the change has to start, not by criticizing or condemning, but through compassion and seeing them in ourselves as well.
Yeah, it's when we draw these comparisons that we can start to see if they're doing that about something we can see. Maybe we're doing it about something that we can't see, but maybe they could see. Are there ways that we could get a bigger picture on ourselves and see how the world has become so complicated that every ordinary action we take is harnessed to all these longer term consequences that might be negative?
Yeah, and that I have to say that I was not this environmentally conscious for many, many years. I have changed.
Right,
So
we learn.
now I need to think about how I changed and
Exactly.
what stimulated or what got me to think differently, because I do feel guilty. I mean, once upon a time I was into shoes and I was buying a new pair of shoes at every paycheck I got or something to that effect, that kind of, but then all of a sudden I started thinking differently. And so so very good point, Dave. Was it Dave?
Yeah, that was Dave.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's part of the job of Aristoi, if there were Aristoi, which we don't really have in our culture. It's part of the job of Aristoi to try to look for those deeper patterns and consequences and figure out how to dramatize them in a way that makes them visible to people so they can feel them and think about them. Then it becomes possible to make wiser choices. But as long as things remain invisible, it's just not possible to think through the right thing to do because you're literally trying to think about something you don't know about. Phil and then Sharon.
Yeah, one of the deep problems I have is that the situation has become so polarized. It's almost impossible not to, in a sense, be critical of the other in this sense.
Yes.
And the first thing you have to realize that you yourself have shortcomings.
Yes.
As I said, you yourself are limited in your own ability. And so, but it is hard these days. I'll give you an example that really troubled me. I every month I attend this group. It's in Canada. It's in Edmonton, Canada. That's about racism. So everybody there is pretty much on what I would consider the right side.
Yeah.
And after much discussion, one thing I pointed out was that the thing that troubled me is that we see politics, at least in the United States, as black and white. And what troubled me is that the Native Americans are, in a sense, left out.
Yes.
And I said, it just seems to me, particularly in Canada, there's a lot more Native people than black people in Edmonton. I said, I'm guessing, but that's true. And I said, and yet we're wrapped up in this sort of Black Lives Matter. Not that I'm against Black Lives Matter, but I'm just sort of wondering to what degree when that category is sharply contrast. Now, I'm not blaming the Black Lives Matter people,
right,
because they're trying to include Native Americans.
Right.
But I got a criticism that began to wonder whether I was in the right side, because they couldn't hear that. They just saw it as a criticism. It was a criticism, but it was a self-criticism they ought to think about to expand that. And I mentioned, if there's one people that have suffered more than black people, it's really the Native Americans, because black people by the UN is claimed as violence to humanity, okay? A violation of human rights. But what they said about a Native American was genocide. And that's exactly what it was. And I got criticized and began to ask me why I even used the term American Indians. And I explained to them that I went to a seminar with a person who was allegedly a leader, and I heard her using the term American Indian. I was a little surprised because I was actually perching beyond what I should call them Native Americans or indigenous people or American Indians. I stuck with the older term. And she said, well, the problem with the Native Americans is that there are many, many tribes. Is that the tribe, you should call them by their name, okay?
Yes.
Which is right. But there's also an American Indian movement, which is trying to unify all the tribe together as like a one cohesive thing. And the reason why they use that name in part is, first of all, the American Indian movement actually don't mind that term. They like that term, but also because there's so many historical documents, legal documents that use the term, and they don't want to confuse it by using some other term, okay?
Right.
And that's why after that, I had a more confident using that term. They apologized and said I gave a good explanation. And I said, I personally use the word Black rather than African American, because when I grew up when I was at Berkeley, Black Power, the Black movement, Black is beautiful, that was a perfectly radical term. And I continue to use that until somebody tells me that I trust that don't use that term anymore, okay? And I notice a lot of people in the Black Lives Movement, in fact, it's called not American, Native American, I mean, not African American movement, it's Black Lives Matter. And so I was troubled that they questioned that I was on the wrong side when I was just merely trying to have a suggestion that perhaps we should expand that consciousness a bit more. Now, I do understand that in this case, if they sort of like stop this movement by including others, it might get confusing, okay? So I do understand that, but I was a little shocked that I was almost put in the term that I was on the other side, and maybe I was infiltrating when I was merely being self-critical of ourselves, right? In this case, not myself, but ourselves, our movement. And so until we understand that we must also be self-critical, then in a sense, we are left fighting among ourselves about things rather than, in a sense, have a unified voice. And so there's a problem that if you don't have self-criticism, you're falling into this thing in which the other is always somebody who appears to be attacking the thing that you're at, the exact position you're at. So I think self-criticism is the most important aspect, and accepting the fact that you are not all goody two-shoes 100% is also important, because you're always trying to evolve and improve yourself. And if you're not doing that, being self-critical, then of course it's going to be much easier to criticize others, because of course they're in the wrong and you're in the right. So accept that fact that even as you're in the right, you're not perfectly in the right.
Yes.
So therefore, it's important to remember that aspect. And so
Yeah.
I was actually a little shaken up that I was questioned, considering I was, I belonged to that group for quite a while. They heard the way I speak. And so that's kind of interesting that you could become the enemy from within.
Yeah, the idea that self-criticism is essential to Vernunft is core. And I'm going to anticipate Dave and say at the same time, so is self-compassion. So there's the sense in which, normally we treat them as opposites. But in order to engage in Vernunft, we have to both be able to accept and have compassion for the confused, incomplete state we find ourselves in, while at the same time being able to criticize ourselves, and in fact, interested in criticizing ourselves in a compassionate way to help us open up new possibilities of growth for new lessons to learn and new things that we ought to be struggling in. And it's very hard in a culture based on Verstand, where the law of the excluded middle rules everything, for us to take two things that are supposed to be opposites and merge them together into a single way to treat yourself, that you can compassionately criticize yourself and be critically compassionate at the same time in order to grow without growing in a way where you're bullying yourself. But it's actually the heuristic way to do that, even though our culture doesn't model it for us. So thank you for that, Phil. We've come to the top of the hour, so I'm going to call on Sharon and then Donald, and then we can wrap up.
Well, I'll just be very quick. I want to make a comment that self-criticism and self-acceptance are on the same spectrum paradigm. And I hear what you're saying, Phil, but one of the issues that I think that's very prominent in the culture in which we live is that whole concept of otherism.
Yeah.
And all the subgroups in this culture, if you're not white, have had challenges in just trying to be. Mm-hmm. And the the squeaky wheel gets the oil. That's the concept. That's a basic concept in life.
Yeah.
So I think when you try to criticize the other, you kind of engender defensiveness among the group that's being criticized. And I try to see people in light of their spirit, compassion, according to Dave, and what they're achieving. But that's not the messages that the culture sends you.
Right.
And that's hard. And when I tell people, when I first came to America, it took me about 10 years to understand what it meant to be Black. I had never been in that sphere of existence because I grew up in a multi-ethnic culture.
Right.
In which the motto was out of many, one people, and the one people were Jamaicans. And that was it. So I am very, my ears perk up so I hear you saying, so why, the American Indians suffered a lot, but the Black people have more prominence. But probably it's just a different, they make a lot more, they're squeakier than the American Indians.
Yeah, and there's a stage in the process of demarginalizing a people where they have to, having been rendered invisible so that they could be preyed upon by the dominant culture, that to get out of that situation, at least for some period of time, they have to focus on themselves and make themselves visible, because if they don't focus, they're already invisible. So any attempt to kind of reemerge without focusing is going to bring them in blurry at best, because the dominant culture, the privileged people still want them reflexively, want them to be invisible, and it'll take a while to unlearn the habits of erasure. So it helps when you've got a movement like the Black Power movement that can focus the visibility in one place to help try to bring them fully into focus. And then once they've entered into focus and they're not, they won't let themselves be made invisible anymore, it's easier from that position of greater strength to then do intersectionality and form alliances with other movements like the American Indian movement. But as long as it remains an abstract, we should be nice to people movements, then it's very hard to overcome the invisibility that's been pushed upon them through the process of marginalization. And that's part of the reason why you tend to get these very focused movements for a while.
Next week.
Yes. Well, first I have to call on Donald, and then I can tell you about next week.
Okay. Sorry, Donald.
Go ahead, Donald.
Makes me want to be extra quick. Well, when I was a mere boy philosopher, one of my mentors said, imagine that there's this old folks home where all these aristoi and philosophers go when they die, and they sit around, and what do they talk about? Do they talk about nothing because they know everything and it's all the same? Or do they talk about the same things they always talk about because all the big questions are undecidable and the conversation just goes on? And I think it's the latter, and that's enough.
So let me offer a third possibility, and I'm not saying it is the third possibility, but just another possibility. And that is that the process of identifying archae and figuring out how to describe them well enough to make them visible not only to Aristoi, but also to Douloi and Banausoi is so difficult that at any given point, but not impossible, that at any given point, we have partial truths about some of the things that are important. And so as a result, there's always more to try to work out about the archae we've already identified, because there's probably better ways to understand them and better ways to explain them that we just haven't come up with yet. And then on the other hand, there are always other archae that we haven't identified at all yet that we don't realize. Because of course the problem with archae is, since they're infinities of infinities, they're in everything, which makes them familiar, which, as Hegel says, makes them not recognized for what they are. So we're like surrounded by all this information that we don't know how to take in and identify. So when someone comes along with a crazy idea that suddenly brings some archae into view that we've all missed until now, there's going to be this riotous heuristic discussion that follows, where everybody's very excitedly painting paintings and composing music and doing interpretive tap dances and everything they can think of to try to triangulate on what is this thing and where is it everywhere in the cosmos and how are we going to explain this to people. And I figured that the imaginary old folks home you're describing would just be full of these activities. There'd be periods where it would it would slow down and everyone's like, well, do we have everything there? And then some new Aristos would show up, you know, who just died. I'd say, I spent my whole life looking at this weird feature of ants. And it was like, ants? He'd say, yeah, did you know they do this? And so does everything else in the universe. And that's where all the Aristoids' heads explode and they all turn into an active period. But this might not be true either. I don't know, because I live under modernism and we don't get to hang out with a bunch of Aristoi, where none of us gets to even become an Aristos. We're all, you know, yearning and striving against the impulses that have been programmed into us to not do it. So it's
trying to understand modernity by reading Kafka or something.
Right? Yeah.
Just to finally realize we're trapped and don't know it.
Yes.
Or maybe it's worse that we're beginning to know it, but we're still trapped.
That's
and
right.
The trap is better than we thought.
Well, that's the horrifying thing about studying these things, is you discover that it's so much more complex and sophisticated than we thought. At the same time, though, it doesn't have to lead to depression, because the nature of our understanding of its increased complexity over what we expected gives us more levers to work with. Instead of being sort of an abstract trap, it becomes a concrete one, if a bigger one, that we might be able to solve concretely if we could just learn enough about it and play with it enough and explore it enough to figure out what makes it tick. So for next week,
is my attitude. The latter is my attitude. I like that. The more I learn is the more I look retrospectively and prospectively, and the comfort zone increases.
Yes.
Okay, so, thank you, Rick.
So for next week, why don't we go back to the text? We'll pick up essay 4 in Mythos and Logos, and we'll carry with us this discussion that we've had about these mentalities and how they work and how they turn into culture. And this isn't the last we'll say about this. We'll keep coming back to it over and over, because, as I said, almost every sentence Kenneth Smith writes is just saturated with this perspective. So bring your notes and on the things you want to talk about in essay 4. And if you've got stuff from earlier essays, feel free to bring those up too. And over the next 4 sessions, we'll finish up Mythos and Logos and then move on to the next book.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Rick. Bye-bye.
Have a great week.
You too. Bye-bye.